Hey, ho ho. Welcome back to what I've chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. Carrying on today with the Van Halen chat. Historical documents, tellings of tales from people that used to be in the band and used to work for the band. We are gonna delve back a little bit into my reactions to the wildlife. Of course, we're kind of thinning those out now. We're about done. I don't think I realized how far I was gonna go with all the Van Halen research. So there's a lot to still cover about the band without even doing justice to their long career. And there's not much left when it comes to my reactions to the film. So you're going to hear that in small bits today. You're going to hear the usual boogie down dance beats that you heard last time with maybe a little fluctuation in tones from my voice on those segments. And you're going to hear me talking to my friend Eve Clark once again about Van Halen over at her place. For what hopefully will be a video series that comes out eventually with some other guests as well, talking about good old Eddie. And I will also remind you before we get too deep into it that this is fully supported by your time and attention and nothing else. If you would like to see the show do better, and why wouldn't you? And you want more people to find out about it, and why wouldn't you? Please feel free to send a link to a friend or someone you know that might dig this kind of thing. Leave a rating or review on the Apple Podcasts if you do that kind of thing, or a thumbs up on the YouTube if you do that kind of thing. There should be no ads as far as I know on any platform that you're using. If so, let me know. And if you have ideas for other movies, other bands to check into and do episodes about, send me an email at justtheworstever@gmail.com. Especially if you're in a country that is not the United States. I'm curious. I check the numbers every couple of weeks, and I'm always excited to see, that people in other countries besides the U.S. are digging the show, apparently. And that makes my cold heart a little warmer every time I see those stats. Also, as I think I mentioned last time, Twitter is done for me. I'm off, so no more communication on @RockFilmRock. But there's patreon.com/RockFilmRock, where you can reach me very directly. There's the emails, and there is on Instagram, Just the Worst Ever, if you are into that kind of thing. Yeah, how are you doing? How's everything? How's your mom? You look good. Great skin. Where'd you get it? You got a guy? You got somebody for that? I need a guy for that. Meanwhile, Van Halen. Now I want to do something, very characteristic of me and my chaotic way of producing this show. I want to jump way ahead in the timeline and read some quotes from former manager of Van Halen, Ray Daniels. And Ray came on after the longtime manager, Ed Loeffler, had died. This is right before Balance. And, of course, that's the last album with Sammy before Van Halen 3, which is when Gary Cherone comes in. He had already been managing Rush. And he felt like it was a good professional challenge for him to try to do both bands. And the guys in Rush, he made sure they were okay with it first before he took on Van Halen. His first impression, he says, was that the Van Halen crew was the polar opposite of Rush. The Rush guys were like the Three Musketeers, all for one, one for all. Van Halen was not like that. There always seemed to be stuff going on, but it was functional. In the beginning, I wasn't trying to deal with the personalities. I was more focused on how to make all their deals better, because they weren't particularly good. Al had brought me in, and Ed endorsed it. That's because he met Alex while Alex was going out with his wife's sister, Kelly. So he says both Al and Sam were very aware of the business side. Eddie didn't really care. He was focused on the music. I mean, he cared. When somebody says a musician doesn't care, it doesn't mean they don't care. It just means it's not their principal concern. Ed knew Al had his eye on the ball. He knew Sam had an element of being a businessman to his personality. I don't think anyone ever asked Michael all that many questions. I don't say that in a bad way or disparagingly. It's just that when you have strong personalities in a band, somebody needs to lay back. As far as the difficulties with working with Van Halen, he started to notice them pretty early on. He says, everything about them was a little difficult. I had the support of the two brothers, and Michael was okay with me. Sammy was somewhat opposed to me, but understood that he had chosen Loeffler, and now the brothers were going to pick their guy. As far as I was concerned, I was going to try to be everybody's manager. Very quickly, I knew there were two camps and that it was not going to be easy. Everything was made a little more difficult because I was based in Toronto. They were in Los Angeles with an LA record company and had previously had an LA manager. I was a foreigner, literally and metaphorically. There was an element of, who is this guy? Why is he here? But it worked out. As time went on, I was accepted, and for a while, everything was okay. He says his goal was to straighten out the business side. I could do better. I could come in a little bit better and stronger than that. He says his goal was to straighten out the business side of Van Halen. He changed agencies, redid the record deal, redid the publishing deal, dealt with the fact that there was a clause in the contract where they would eventually have to give Warner Brothers a best of Van Halen record. He says, I was dealing with all of that. I was not thinking in terms of, oh, geez, how great this would be if David Lee Roth came back, or how great this would be if whatever. That wasn't in my headspace at the time. However, I am, by the way, any Canadian listeners, I'm being neutral here with the accent out of respect for you all. Because if I did try to do some things with the O's here, like a Canuck would say them, I know there's 50 different regional variations there that would be angry at me. Let's see. And even that, I'm sure, like, all of you were like, oh, you just sound like a Native American Indian from an old movie, you dumbass. Not that I sound like that, but that I sound like a stereotype of that. There were an awful lot of people that were obsessed with how big the band would be if they reunited with David, but that wasn't where I was. He says he realizes it was essentially Eddie's band. Eddie was the primary reason the people came to see them. He was the superstar in the band. It was a unique situation. Yeah, we know this. Eddie's the blah, 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 blah. He acknowledges that, David was perfect for the MTV era. Sammy had a different set of skills. But he was also essential when the band needed to grow. But Eddie Van Halen was the brand. And, of course, Al as well, but because it was a package deal. They were brothers. They were as close as two people could be. He also mentions, when it comes to control, Sammy Hagar was in control where he wanted to be. He says, my sense was that Sam did not think he was going to be in Van Halen for the rest of his life. He had a solo career that had done well. He saw joining Van Halen as a boost to his brand. I think, in his mind, he didn't know if he was going to be with them for 1, 2, or 3 records. But they were so successful together. How could he not do it again and again and again? And I'll skip ahead a bit. This is, by the way, from the Eruption book by Tolinsky and Gill. And he talks about Eddie's personality. Eddie was working towards, getting sober at this time. He says, contrary to rumors of him being the one who splintered the band, it was already a divided camp when he came in. But that was normal for the brothers. They were a divided camp with David. I don't think they ever had somebody that they truly got along with other than the 2-year period with Gary Cherone. And if you were paying attention during that time, like myself, who bought the Guitar World magazine with a black and white cover with Eddie Van Halen on it, wearing the Who the Fuck is Eddie Van Halen t-shirt, and read that interview with him, 7 times, because he just seemed like he was in such a good place and had so many cool things to say, and he was very excited about the new album. He talked about how he just loved being around Gary Cherone so much, he moved him into his house. He's like an all or nothing thing. Yeah, and that, had to end pretty abruptly at some point. says, Eddie worked 24/7 on the music. Sammy was a little more grown up. He wanted a life beyond being up all night in a recording studio. There was a Peter Pan element to Ed. He never really had to grow up. He was a rock star. He was like Elvis Presley. There were always people around him taking care of everything. Sam was much more of a grown-up. He wanted success and was driven to have success, but he wanted a life and a lifestyle beyond being a guy in a band. Ed, on the other hand, was happy to have his relationship with Valerie and Wolfgang, but his focus was on his guitar and his music. That was his life. He talks about his obsession with being in the studio all the time and that being sort of an extension of his instruments, his own recording studio. He compares him to Prince in that way. Everything he did revolved around music, his Paisley Park studio and touring. He lived it. Ed was the same kind of person. When they ask about bringing David Lee Roth back in the picture, he says, I think I'm the only manager that worked with all three singers. Well, I had seen how the band functioned with Sam. I had seen what happened when David came back to do just the greatest hits and the little MTV thing. Then, of course, I was there for the cycle with Gary. Question about outside forces encouraging the Roth reunion. He says, I don't know if anyone would have said that to Al or Ed, but fuck, everyone was all over me about it. As soon as it was rumored that the band was having problems with Sam, I started hearing from promoters, the record company, agents, and a million other people of how big it would be if David came back. 1984 had been their biggest record. David had left when they were as big as they were ever going to get. That's a point, I think, that should be brought up more often. That's a kind of a good way to go out for David Lee Roth to capitalize on that sort of momentum, but he didn't, as we know. He kind of stewed for a little bit with nothing to do and then got his own band together, which was initially seemed like it was going to be a bit of a departure from Van Halen when it comes to the video for California Girls and Just a Gigolo. And I know I'm messing up the timeline here, but it is widely known among friends of mine who have told me these kind of things that basically the David Lee Roth band initially was, doing the auditions, getting guys together, getting Steve Vai and Billy Sheehan, and I'm really sorry I don't know the drummer's name. I've never bought a single David Lee Roth record or listened to more than one song at a time, but he was sort of like, yeah, you guys go do your thing as far as pre-production and being in the studio. Like, just do what you awesome musician stuff that you do, and I'll find my spots to sing over. He gave them a lot of free reign and creative control. I don't know how that worked out with songwriting credits or publishing. Hopefully it was good. I don't think they would have stuck around otherwise. Steve Vai's pretty smart fella when it comes to that thing. If you want to hear more about Steve Vai, I have 2 episodes from a ways back in the feed about the movie Crossroads that focus on him and the history of shred guitar. And then one about Crossroads that focuses on Robert Johnson. They're all, I think each one of them is about 3 hours long. But back to the point about David Lee Roth leaving at their commercial peak, I think that works more in his favor than in the band's favor, since they came back with somebody so different and a songwriting style that was so different. But that was naturally where Eddie was going anyway. I think to have overcome that and sold as well as they did is truly a marvel. People like to cite AC/DC as being the one big, success story when it comes to replacing your lead singer. Absolutely it is. But they didn't change much about their writing style, instrumental-wise and arranging-wise. It was still the same feel. There's a reason why Brian Johnson still sounds great on certain AC/DC songs from the Bon Scott era. I'm very opinionated about which ones those are, but I think he had a lot going for him, and the band had a lot going for it. It still had not commercially peaked. They knew they had something bigger to do in the studio. Anyway, Eddie, it was much more of a like, we're gonna do what we want to do, what I want to do. I'm gonna write how I want to write, and we're gonna find the right singer to do that. And he seems like just a cool cucumber through it all. That would have scared a lot of people. That would have shaken a lot of people up. David, by comparison, as we'll get into later, if not in this episode, there might be a episode after this. I'm not sure yet. I'm not done editing and recording everything. But I've already recorded a bit with Dave where he talks about kind of how stuck and lost he was after the split with Van Halen. He didn't have a plan. He was sort of in limbo for a little bit. So I guess I'm saying emotionally, Eddie had more going for him after the split than David did. But professionally, David would have had more going for him, like as far as public perception goes, and to look back on it and go, hey, still the stuff with me was the best stuff, even though they're trying to tell you it's not. They keep telling you I suck, and that the stuff that they did with me wasn't all that good compared to what they're doing now. But numbers don't lie. He says, let's see, back to Ray Daniels. He wasn't involved in getting Dave back in the studio at all. He said that was all Ed. I believe Ed made the call to David. I don't think Al loved the idea, but we were trying to get 2 new songs for a best of album, and Sam was against releasing one. It didn't matter what I thought when it comes to Dave's comeback. It was Ed's studio at Ed's home, Ed's bedroom, living room, or whatever you want to call it. Ed was in control of it. If Ed wanted somebody to come and make music with the band, they just had to come. It wasn't like we had to go book a studio or get a budget or do any of the things most bands at their level would have to do. It was like, boom, Ed has his full studio, and he made his records there. He had a full-time engineer and a guitar roadie. He was set up. All he had to do was make a call and get David to go there and make Al aware of it. At first, Al's reaction was, we're not reforming with him. Let's just do these 2 songs. I think Al made it clear to David, but I don't think David was really listening. I think that's a very plausible explanation, personally. He says, David's career wasn't doing as well. He made a little bit of noise early on, but he needed the reunion more than they did. I'm sure he was eager to get back to that level of success, and if it had worked and the magic had been there, because we're talking about the best of Volume 1, which there was never, unfortunately, Volume 2. Not best of both worlds. The first reunion, the Me, Wise Magic, David Lee Roth, right? And we're not talking about another kind of truth era, David Lee Roth. Magic wasn't there. They didn't fall in love again, if they'd ever been in love. Were you at the MTV show when Ed and David fell out? Did you go, uh-oh? Yes. If you don't know, folks, MTV Video Music Awards, I believe it was 96. Could be wrong. I'm off. I know it's not 95. Could be 97. I'm guessing. But Van Halen comes out to present an award or something. And David's like, yeah, we're back, baby. Woo! And he won't get off the mic and he won't shut up. And he keeps saying things, these non sequiturs like he tends to do, or he tended to do later in life. And it's like, he clearly was just like, yep, it's like the 1984 VMAs all over again. I never left, and this is my audience. And the most uncomfortable thing is not him saying things that aren't funny. The most uncomfortable thing is Michael Anthony standing sort of off to the side of, he's not right up close, I don't think, if I remember correctly, and him throwing his head back in laughter, and hysterical, hyena-like laughter, at everything David says, because he's clearly like a child, he's so uncomfortable, daddy's making rude remarks because he's drunk, and the son is trying to diffuse the tension by rewarding him with laughter, before things get worse. That's how I felt seeing it. It says, none of it was fun. It was just chaotic, but for some people in the room, it seemed normal. It wasn't normal for me. There was enormous pressure from MTV to push the band and Dave together for the show. There was also enormous pressure from the label to do it. There was no great plan on my part to get David back. I was quite happy with the level of success they had had with Sam. I heard too many stories about how they didn't get along with Dave to think that he was going to come back and it would suddenly be great. The other side of that coin was, well, the guy's been gone for 10 years. Maybe he's learned something. Maybe he's changed. Interviewer says, that almost never happens. His response, never happens, never happens, never happens. I haven't looked at the MTV footage since that night. I just remember it being something I wished we hadn't done, but there was no easy way to get out of it. Everybody wanted them to do it. It was very difficult in those days to say no to both your label and MTV, especially when they were pressuring you at the same time. My recollection is of the chaos that was going on behind the scenes and trying to keep a handle on that. It was not fun. One thing that's fun to do for me always is to jump into some media from the actual time of the artist's, maybe commercial peak or just existence or their ascendancy or whatever. Some relevant period in their history where I can find actual magazine articles and interviews from back in the day, so we can get a real perspective on, what was being communicated to the audience at the time, as opposed to a historian's view looking back. Because it's usually, some specific details that are kind of fun, or attitude moments that are fun or very revealing that you don't get in a scholarly look back at the history of, a band's entire career. That kind of stuff's not always the most important when you've got a publishing deadline to worry about, and you need to make sure that your book tells a story, a cohesive beginning, middle, and end, hopefully. And this one is going to be an excerpt from Hit Parader magazine, April 1984. So we're peak. I mean, we are peak Van Halen success with David Lee Roth before things fall apart. Let me think here. I want to say it's before the US Festival, but let me check to be sure. May. Oh my gosh. May 1982 and 80. Oh, there was a second one in 83. That's right. But then another entry online says September 82. Well, regardless, it's after the US Festival. Okay. So this is Van Halen, The High Life, subtitled Rock's Wild Bunch Return to Action with 1984 by Andy Sesher. Guns N' Roses fans like me can't read that without hearing, that means you, Andy Sesher at Hit Parader. But the funny thing is, I have another Hit Parader magazine open digitally on archive.org, which is where I got this one. From the same year, 1984, in August. And David Lee Roth is being interviewed in that one by someone else. Not Andy Sesher at Hit Parader, but Andy Sesher has a feature story called Motley Crue, The Wild Bunch. So he just couldn't help himself. Just a few months apart, and he's calling both bands The Wild Bunch. Amazing film, by the way. Thank you, Sam Peckinpah. So back to Hit Parader from April. It's got pictures of David and of Eddie, but it's just an interview with David, it looks like. And there's the usual introduction. Oh, with the release of the album, the band is coming into this new phase, and here's all their talent on display, and determination and success, love for rock and roll, et cetera, et cetera. There's just some cool quotes from Mr. David Lee Roth, even though things were about to get nasty between him and the brothers. I think it is irrelevant and maybe even important and valuable to actually give credit to him for pumping up the talent of everyone else in the band. He's not coming off like a self-obsessed solo star here that's trying to downplay the importance of the rest of the band by any means. And he's also seems like he's doing a pretty good job of not griping or indicating any turmoil going on behind the scenes. Hit Parader asks him if he's surprised by how the album is doing. He says, "Are you kidding? This is the best album we've ever done. It's supposed to do very well. Now, if we could only get a little record company support, you'd really see it take off. It's a great record because of the variety that's on it. Using synthesizers and keyboards on a couple of the cuts takes what we've done before one step further. Some people say that Van Halen has lost some of its edge. Well, that's not true at all. We're rocking as hard as we ever have. We're just expanding the sound a bit." They mentioned the fact that, albums before this took a lot less time to record and produce. And David says, "We took more time with this one than we have in the past. It wasn't that we needed the extra time as much as we just felt like trying some new things, and that took longer than we expected. Usually the whole process from start to finish takes us about 3 weeks. This time it took about a week and a half longer." Jesus, that's nothing. Edward had built a new studio, so we enjoyed fooling around there and working on new sounds and new techniques. They ask about rumors. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the recording schedule for the album. Is that true? Your record company forced you into the studio. David says, nobody forces Van Halen to do anything. The truth of the matter is that I'm starting to go into a little bit of David Lee Roth by way of Jack Nicholson as impersonated by Christian Slater in his early films. Pardon me, folks, but I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Nobody forces Van Halen to do anything. The truth of the matter is that we had intended to tour Europe and Japan after we had finished our tours of North and South America. That's when Warner Brothers stepped in and said, hey, according to your contract, you owe us an album pretty soon. So when we realized they were right, we canceled our tour plans and set about making the album. We did it at our own pace, a few days on, a few weeks off. But it did get done. Favorite song of the album, he likes Panama. I was getting tired of reading Hit Parader that all of Van Halen's songs were about girls, cars, and parties. The truth is that I'd never written a song about cars. So one day, we all went down to the drag races in Fontana, California, and there was this great set of wheels there called the Panama Express. So when I wrote this song called Panama, it was where we keep referring to the car as a girl. You'd understand why I did that if you'd seen my last couple of girlfriends. They were just like cars. You couldn't get their engines started in the morning. Asked about how a Van Halen song comes together. He says, there's actually 3 things you need to make a Van Halen song. A lot of talent, a large glass, and some cracked ice. Actually, Edward is usually down in our basement rehearsal hall playing the riffs that will make up the song. I get visual images from what he plays. He could play one thing and I'll say, hey, that's about cowboys. He'll play something else and I'll get a mental picture of outer space or robbing a 7-Eleven. 9 out of 10 times what you hear on one of our albums is a live recording of the song. And usually it's the first or second take. We don't believe in overdubs. They say it's got to be pretty tough trying to sing over some of the things that Edward plays on guitar. He says, you're not kidding. His guitar playing has become much more sophisticated over the last year or so. He's been playing with a lot of other people. Hell, he practically invented the guitar lines on Michael Jackson's Beat It. Citation needed there. And he started playing some really hyper-sophisto things. Sometimes I just tell him that instead of flying up and down the fretboard, he ought to just strum an E chord over and over again like Bob Dylan used to do. That's something I can sing over. Now that Van Halen's been around for 8 years, they say, how do you view the band's influence on the music scene? I like to think that we've had a very resounding influence on rock and roll. It's not just because so many people are copying our style, the short songs and the stage raps, but because so many people have been so totally revolted by us that a whole bunch of groups seem to have emerged that seem determined to do the exact opposite of Van Halen. We've helped bring a lot of variety into popular music. They mentioned them spawning some imitators with hard rock bands like Quiet Riot, showing a strong influence from Van Halen. It seems the style and sound you pioneered is more popular than ever. No doubt about it, but there's a point where mimicking one band turns into your own inspiration. Van Halen had bands that inspired us, and by copying them, we were able to develop our own style. After a while, you've got to break away from copying someone else and strike out on your own. I haven't seen Quiet Riot in a long time, so I really shouldn't say if they're copying us or not. All I know is they're creating good rock and roll and that they're entertaining people, so more power to them. And they ask about influences. There's no covers on 84 after performing so many covers on Diver Down. And David says, we had a lot of extra time to work on this album, so there was no need to do any cover tunes. We actually had 5 or 6 tunes left over after we finished recording the album. I'm curious about those now. That's never happened to us before. We had considered doing a version of Midnight Hour for the new record, but in the end, we decided we would make a better techno-pop song than a Van Halen tune. We also didn't want to record anything that would seem so blatantly commercial. Since when doesn't Van Halen want commercial success? Asks Andy Sesher of Hit Parader. Man, that's never been our thing. Having hits isn't our concern. It doesn't interest us, really. Having hits is Warner Brothers' problem. If you want to see a real problem, check out their stock dividends this year. That company's almost bankrupt. Jesus. There's a good reason for that, too. Just look at the Diver Down album as an example. The company totally fucked up on that one. It made it up to 11 in the charts and was selling jillions of copies. Then some coke freak at Warner's forgot to turn his paperwork in, and the album fell to 39 in 1 week. That's never happened in the history of the world. They say that they're trying to shape up a little, but most of the same morons are still working there. On a more positive note, when we know you have to travel when you're not recording or touring. We had a feature on your trip to the Amazon and Hit Parader a few months back. Do you have your next venture lined up? Yeah, next summer we'll probably be heading to New Guinea. That's a place you don't get to too often on tour. Hell, they don't even have radios down there, so rock and roll is something they know nothing about. They're still into sending signals by drum. It's a great change of pace from the rock and roll scene. I'm getting sick of all the pretty boys who have their week ruined by a little rain. When you spend a few weeks in the Amazon, when you're always wet, something like that just doesn't seem so bad. In fact, after living in trees for a week or two, nothing seems very bad. I guess a venture like that really prepares you for touring. It sure as hell does. When an amp stops functioning in the middle of a set or a microphone stops working, you just say, no problem, man. You just wait for the road crew to fix whatever's wrong. Traveling to places where you have to live by your wits gives you a very good perspective on what's really important in life. Now that the band is going back on the road, is there any thought to doing a live album in the near future? We've been recording shows for years and years. Where are they, please? Please, please, Van Halen estate. Please release the tapes. Please release videos. God damn. I mean, I know they've probably been bootlegged to hell, but please. We've been recording shows for years and years, and we've got more than enough stuff for an album like that. It becomes a question of how you can do a live album and give the people something that sounds new. I was in a record store the other day when somebody came in with the live Pat Benatar album. He slapped it on the counter and said, I thought there was new stuff on this. If we could do something like The Who did with Live at Leeds, it would be different. They were able to play all your favorites, yet they did it in a way that was new and exciting. Wasn't there a thought to releasing some of the tracks from the US Festival as a live album? Not really. We had to mix some of the tracks for the TV special they did, but that's about it. We had fun with that. We mixed the crowd reaction way up so it sounded like we were doing absolutely insane. Like they were going absolutely insane. Man, the whole festival scene was scary. I woke up in the middle of the night for a week after that in a cold sweat. It's an incredible experience to be up on stage in front of 300,000 people. Didn't you get in a bit of trouble there by trying to incite the crowd to riot? Nothing of the sort. I've never told anyone what they should do. I'll leave that to people like The Clash. About all I did was tell everyone, hey, fuck the concert. Let's all go across the road and get ourselves a drink. Now let's talk a bit about US Festival stuff, eh? Let's talk a bit about The Clash with The Clash, eh? Now the time period leading up to the US Festival situation, were in Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay in the beginning parts of 1983. And then, good places to play in January. warm for the Americans. And they traveled with plenty of booze, beer, and, took excursions down the wild rivers of these South American countries. There were, notably, according to Ian Christie and Everybody Wants Some, fresh from military dictatorships in several stops, the South American rock scene was still a fly-by-night business where unsavory characters were eager to take full advantage of freedom. Van Halen loved the adventure. They were recharging their own youthful enthusiasm, the wild spirit that dies when portioned out only in marketable pieces. They were among the first Yankee marauders to leap off the pages of magazines onto South American stages. The gesture was appreciated, especially as golden-haired Roth rapped to crowds in Spanish. Eddie ripped through Spanish Fly, and Alex's drum solo adopted Latin-inspired licks. We sold 140,000 tickets and maybe 15,000 albums, Roth told Faces. We had motorcades, escorts. We were treated like national heroes. Now I know how to fight for the right to do this the right way, to tour when we want to in the right way. Turn off the goddamn bass amplifiers, will ya? Shut them down, Dave shouted in Buenos Aires before winging the 4-minute Spanish version of O Argentina, accompanying himself on acoustic guitar. He unfurled a large Argentine flag before launching into Ice Cream Man. and at that moment probably could have been elected president. While the tour continued, Eddie unfortunately lost the chance to produce a record for one of his influences, the British jazz fusion stylist Alan Holdsworth. Now a powerful protege, Eddie had paved the way for Holdsworth's IOU band to sign with Warner Brothers. He wanted to work with a player he had already declared a guitar hero's guitar hero. Unfortunately, Holdsworth grew tired of waiting for Van Halen and forged ahead with producer Ted Templeman. Eddie was disgruntled, especially since he wanted to play with guest vocalist Jack Bruce from Cream. But Holdsworth had underestimated the value of Eddie's fingers. He found himself back on an indie label within a year. When Van Halen retreated from South America at the end of February, Roth lingered below the equator for a few weeks of overachiever's holiday. Renting a rickety riverboat named the Marcia, he launched a 6-week jungle expedition up the Amazon River with his best friend, Van Halen security chief Big Ed Anderson. They requested a visa from the Brazilian government to visit protected Amazonian Indian tribes living in the densest rainforest near Peru. It was a reverse kind of missionary adventure where Roth and Big Ed indoctrinated themselves in the ways of jungle survival. They hunted and fished in loincloths, and Roth got mosquito bites the size of golf balls. They happened upon a remote village. You hear that a lot. Like, I'll believe that when it comes to hail that falls from the sky that's the size of golf balls. Is there a medical precedent for that being a thing in South America? Just people just get mosquito bites that are as big as golf balls there. Seems like a terrible place to live an entire life for a whole lot of people if that were the case. I don't know if I believe it. I'm not a doctor. If you're a doctor and a South American one at that, please call in. Or someone that has been around South American mosquitoes and seen the effects of their bites. They happened upon a remote village where the locals threw a pinga and, sorry guys, kahaka, I want to say, or kachaka, sugarcane alcohol party for their guests that Dave described as Triple Christmas. As Roth and Big Ed's boat sputtered into the heart of darkness, the villages along the river were warned of the advance of the Americans by shortwave radio. The entourage was hard to miss. At the final stop, they were welcomed with a desperate message, "Call home." Some kind of catastrophe had happened that needed immediate attention back in the States. As it turned out, Van Halen had been offered $1 million to play a single show in front of 500,000 people, and they were freaking out because their singer was floating around in a jungle out of contact. So Roth and Big Ed located a German geological expedition and were bivouacked out of the Amazon during a fierce rainstorm. They spent 4 more days traveling back to California. A week and a half later, after a brief hospital visit, Dave was cured of microbes, parasites, stings, dehydration, and was ready for Memorial Day.
All this time. There we
All
are.
this time.
All this time. What do you know?
Cool. So that one's going?
Yep.
And that one's going?
Yep.
Okay.
Is that one going?
It's about to. Yes. Stray thoughts about the guitar playing on Van Halen 2. Bottom, let's see. I talked about Bottoms Up, but there's this... oh, yes. Man, do I hate Michael Anthony's bass tone at the beginning of Out of Love Again. Eddie's all pinch harmonic break after the first chorus. It's not even a solo. It's just a quick break before the next verse comes in. It's another one of those You Really Got Me and I'm the One. It's that LaGrange, ZZ Top kind of thing that, they were covering ZZ Top early on. So I'm sure he started playing around with those harmonics. If he hadn't before he heard Billy Gibbons, then I'm sure it started happening after that. But he the only person in that era that took the harmonics to another place and more pitch changes and stuff on the same exact fret, on the same exact string, Then there's also the move he does where there's a volume knob swell with like a couple of notes held down, like not a full chord maybe, but it's on one of the tracks on Van Halen 2, I think it's Call Me a Doctor. Yes, it sounds like a guitar, like a car whizzing past you. And he does like 2 or 3 of them. Like there's some car that's like going around in circles, and you don't like the Doppler effect is messing with you.
Loose sequel to Fast Times.
It was.
It kind of not really. I mean, you just kind of look at Chris Penn as, oh, that must be Spicoli's brother, and it's a different story. But was that a fun movie for you to work on?
It was. It was. And Chris was Chris was a ball of contradictions.
Right.
He cared about what he was doing, but it never got in the way of his having a good time.
Oh, for sure.
And, he was a hedonist.
Yes, he lived life to the fullest.
He did. And I became very close friends with Sean Penn, and our friendship remained for years.
Right.
That clip was an interview with Jenny Wright from Earl Skakel, his YouTube channel, and his podcast, Inappropriate Earl, podcast episode 323 with actress Jenny Wright, Wright. Please feel free to check that full interview out if you want. Look him up on YouTube. Inappropriate Earl Podcast 323. I want to jump into a Musician Magazine article from 1984, month of June. Cover story, The Oddest Couple, Can It Last? Van Halen by Charles M. Young. And on the cover, we see David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen together, both looking at the camera. David's doing a pose, a very serious, sucking in his cheeks pose with sunglasses on, his hand up below his chin. Sorry, my hand goes up to the microphone, up below his chin, like he's about to pose for like a class picture or something, or an advertisement maybe for cologne. Who knows? He's looking pretty trendy and sharp, and Eddie is just doing the like arms crossed, leaning his head back on David's shoulders, like smiling, like, "Hey, what's going on? We're keeping it casual here." He's got a cigarette in his hand. The other sub headlines are XTC, Joe Jackson, Black Flag, Huey Lewis, The Smiths, and Russian Jazz. So I'll skip the intro. They mentioned Valerie Bertinelli trying to, spend as much time with her husband as possible. Eddie backstage before a show at the St. Paul Civic Center says, "It only happens when she's not working. When she's sitting around watching TV, she wants to spend time with me when I have to work. I'm not saying I always work, but I'm always writing. I like to get my ideas down so I don't forget them. At least it's at my new studio in his backyard and not some studio in Hollywood. On a scale of marital problems, this one seems to score way below divorce. Put it this way," says Valerie Bertinelli, now retired from the sitcom One Day at a Time, between acting jobs and much nicer than any journalist would expect of someone so ungodly pretty. "I know whose mistresses are, and they aren't female. My only threats are the guitar and the synthesizer." They talk some more about Eddie. Rock and roll talent is like giving a Ferrari to a 15-year-old kid with a learner's permit. He's got a good chance of driving it into the nearest bridge, abutment, and ending up a drug overdose, a drooling lunatic, a raving asshole, or a deaf megalomaniac. But if he teaches himself how to drive, he's the coolest thing on the road. Eddie Van Halen's guitar is probably the meanest, most dangerous Ferrari now on the road. He has learned to keep it under control, however, by hitching it to a semi-trailer full of guilt and humility. Key word here is different, or as Eddie pronounces it, different. Sometimes he will go so far as to accept a compliment on his music, admitting he rates it more interesting than the usual stuff one hears at the heavy, hard, high, big end of rock. But then he's got to lacerate himself a little, call himself weird, or worse to get his equilibrium back. All in all, if you must deal in words, the non-judgmental different ranks as the optimum objective. It's not really a talent, says Eddie, impaling an unfiltered Pall Mall on an inch of guitar string sticking out of a tuning F knob. Tuning F knob. What is a tuning F knob? I mean, it's the tuners. It's not sticking out of the knob. It sticks out of the. If you leave the uncut, if you leave some of the excess string popping off your tuning pegs, it's coming off the shaft. It's not coming off of a knob, and it's not an F. It's maybe an E. I don't know. But sorry, that threw me. I don't. It's an obsession. I'm not saying I'm better than anyone else. I'm different. I play different. I'm obsessed with music. I'm selfish. I'm a sick fuck. Name of my studio is 5150. That's the police code for escaped mental case. Don Landy and I are both. He engineered all our records, but he's more than an engineer. He and I basically produced the last record. We're both 5150s. I'm not saying I'm an unsocial asshole, but I don't need humans a lot. I got my wife. I got my brother. I got my parents. I got Don. That's it concerning deep humans. Don, he did a lot to get me mentally healthier, to be able to let all that stuff out and not worry. I have some things on tape that would clear the room. And I wonder if he means that it's very experimental musically. It's really obnoxious. It's not as musical. It's a lot of expressions of rage and frustration, perhaps. They mention, well, that doesn't, necessarily make him insane, a 5150. For me, it's normal, Eddie says. And the interviewer says, everyone else is sick. No, I'm not saying I'm holier than thou. He stutters around for the right words. If there were 10 people in a room, 9 of them would not be like me. That makes me the weirdo, but not in my mind. Because they don't understand the things that I do doesn't make me crazy. But I'm not saying they're crazy either. In this society, I'm 5150. In my mind, I'm not. I'm just different. Another area where Eddie Van Halen is different is his attitude toward money. In his view, it distorts the artistic process, so he doesn't think about it. He did not, for example, receive any payment for his arranging or guitar solo on Beat It. This was, of course, one of the all-time great guitar solos. An electrifying moment of the best cut of an album that has, as at this writing, sold more than 30 million copies. Eddie counts himself lucky to have made friends with the producer Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson. Maybe he'll give me dance lessons someday. Expresses mid-annoyance, I assume that's mild annoyance, only with his fellow band members and manager for thinking him foolish. This disregard for money extends to Van Halen as well. He's the only guy who writes music, yet he shares publishing credit with everyone. Here's this sticky wicket again. Eddie says, 10 years ago, we sat down at Dave's father's house and said, well, what are we going to do if we make it? I said, split it 4 ways. There are 4 people, right? This was before we found out I'm the only one who writes. I made my own bed, so I'm sleeping in it. It's like being married. You find out things about your wife later on, but you're still married. So what the fuck? I could be an asshole about it, but it would just create problems. God, dude. It's not the kind of thing you talk about in public if you're happy with the situation. It's like, well, they got me over a barrel. I was foolish enough to be kind and generous to them with the writing credits, I mean, I think by that point, having had the band going for a while, he knew what everyone was capable of contributing, I think he did it with the best of intentions personally, and if he doesn't care about money, I think he's a weird guy. He's complex, obviously, and he would say the same thing. I'm sure he has said the same thing many, many times, but everyone has attitudes that are contradictory, don't we? Don't we all? He always was the sort of like the guy I would read in interviews with, and he would say, I don't deal with the business. I just tell my manager, let me know when I'm broke. Which is how, which hopefully means he had a very good accountant and a very good lawyer and a very good agent, as well as a good manager at various times, because that's a confidence you can only have if you know that books are being taken care of. And I think at the time that I read that article, it was Ray Daniels that would have been in the managerial seat. And he has said in the interview included in this episode or series that he, with Rush, he always knew where all the money was at all times. So he was very meticulous about that stuff. So it's like, I don't care about the money. Money's not a big deal. And, the money just, it compromised the integrity of the decisions that a band would make. But at the same time, he says, I just have to deal with the fact that I was essentially implying that I was foolish enough to give everyone a quarter of the publishing money, even though they're not pulling their weight. And I would rather they didn't get that money, right? That's what he's saying, right? Not a unique attitude among young musicians, this disdain for money, but rare in a veteran of 11 years and 6 albums. Van Halen 2, Women and Children First, Fair Warning, Diver Down in 1984, and Van Halen. It is an astonishingly eccentric body of work. Some of the most commercial hard rock ever played, mixed with interludes of 5150 music that just leave you stunned. Can anyone explain Sunday Afternoon in the Park on Fair Warning? The obvious comparison is Led Zeppelin, an equally eccentric band who also appealed first to teenagers in their capacity for wonder, and only later to critics. But where Led Zeppelin went for drone and moan and high decibel alpha waves, Van Halen goes for pure adrenaline, packing 8 musical ideas into a time frame that most bands would take to establish one idea. They were hypnotic, says Eddie. That's something I'm not allowed to go after. Meaning David Lee Roth doesn't like hypnotic songs? Well, what's he going to do? He can't dance to them. I like hypnotic. You haven't heard all my music. Nobody knows what I do. They've only seen the one of me, which is Van Halen. Roth's vocal energy, as integral to the VH sound as Eddie's guitar, has never garnered much critical praise. People don't see past his image to listen to him, and he's good. A complete motherfucker, man. Okay, so he's not an opera singer. Is Jagger? Kids come because they would like to live the fantasy of Dave. That image, fuck all night and get wasted. But that's Dave and not me. It's never been Eddie? Or it's never been Eddie? I don't know. In 78, I ran around squeezing everything that walked. Thought that's where I would find happiness. But I rapidly found out different. I would just lie in bed staring at the ceiling thinking, is this it? There's got to be more. So it made me get into this more. Eddie strokes a thunderous power chord because I get more out of it. Ever wonder what your mother might think of some of Roth's lyrics? I don't know what the lyrics are. If you lock David Lee Roth in a Texas steel cage death match with Journey, Quiet Riot, Iron Maiden, and Abdullah the Butcher, Roth would be the guy to walk out alive, spit on the bleeding cadavers of his enemies, and incite the crowd to tear up their seats and club any vestiges of civilized authority into the cement. This is no shit. The guy's been taking kickboxing lessons from Benny the Jet Urquidez, a champion in Hong Kong and Japan, where anyone who ain't a kickboxer is a wimp. It's funny, the Texas death match being mentioned. It's Wednesday, August 23rd as I read this, and Terry Funk has just passed away. That's all I got to say. If you know who that is, you know why I mention it. If you don't, it's no big deal. Carry on. That, by the way, that last paragraph, that was the text. That was the magazine. That wasn't Eddie saying that. It's a good way to get your yayas out, says Roth, who exudes a quiet confidence, make that loud confidence, stemming from the certain knowledge that he can kill any interviewer instantly with his bare feet. I wanted the most severe training I could put myself through, so I went to Benny the Jet and said, I want to do this 5 mornings a week, and did for, 10.5 months. The rope, heavy bags, speed bags, shin training technique, the throws, and I did road work every night. When I started, I couldn't run around the block without heaving and blowing. I got up to 6-8 miles by the end. Of course, you can't train like that on tour. You have to gird all your energy for that one nighttime shot. That's a 2-hour bout right there. And you don't get to sit in the corner after every round. This is not just standing there projecting. I spend fully 33% of my time off the ground. Yeah, but why kickboxing as opposed to, say, aerobic dancing? It's competition at the maximum, says Roth, who looks almost as healthy at 4 a.m. in a St. Paul hotel room as he does performing at a distance. There's no chess pieces between you, not any form of equipment. Hitting somebody else, anyone can do that. The trick is not getting hit and taking care of your business. There's a whole lot of strategy involved, a whole lot of developing incredible presence of mind, focus, control of your most basic instincts, fear, anger, vengeance. I wonder if he talked about this on Joe Rogan when he was on. I've seen clips of it, but it's mostly Dave making himself laugh, saying things like, "Is there laughter in heaven? I asked a bunch of nuns that. They didn't have an answer. They just smiled at me." Because, David is such a philosopher. He's, it's like it's like people that say, I think it's annoying that people, my friends don't think it's worth talking about politics. I think that's, it's very privileged of them to think that they can keep their heads out of politics, like it doesn't affect them. And that's what makes me, that when I hear those kind of things, I think, yeah, they probably just don't want to talk to you about politics. They probably do think about politics plenty, and they know better than to engage with you about it. All that is to say, I don't think that group of nuns felt like talking to Dave about what goes on up in heaven. They ask him if he can summon up this mindset at will. It's something you learn over hours and hours of practice. I'm not exaggerating. Hours and hours and hours and hours. That's the only way to do it. You can concentrate on more on any one thing, whether it's a lover or a contact or an audience. Audiences fall somewhere in between. Given to flamboyant jumpsuits and scarves around the neck in his private as well as public dress, and an entourage of dwarves in karate suits, Roth smokes, drinks, consumes a fair amount of junk food, and generally tears himself down with an exuberance to match the discipline with which he builds himself up. You gotta balance it out, says Roth. I don't do anything all the time. When critics are not complaining that Roth is boorish, cynical, and an evil influence on today's youth, they object that his voice is a one-note piano, or more accurately, bellow. We have songs that run at a different intensity, but they're still high-pressure songs, like I'll Wait. Totally different feeling from something like Jump. I'll Wait has a very somber tone, almost sad, but it still has a lot of torque. It gives the impression of being fast. Throughout the history of the band, we've had a number of different sounding songs. I was revisiting I'll Wait last week because I found that there was a live version from the Tokyo album they put out with David Lee Roth from the, some kind of, a new kind of truth, some kind of truth, a different kind of truth. Fuck, sorry, everybody. It's been a while since the album came out in 2007 or whatever the heck it was. I was surprised. I don't think the mix did it any favors. Not that the mix was bad, but there's definitely, it didn't do anything to downplay the competing for space in your ears effect that you get with Eddie playing guitar all over the song. Like if you're not a fan of the keyboard stuff on 1984, check out the live version of I'll Wait, because he's talking all the way through the song on that guitar. While David is singing he's singing his parts pretty well. I mean, the notes are there, the delivery's there. It's different, I'm obviously just way too used to the recorded version and how much structure there is to it, and it lets me sort of relax and feel the overall vibe of the tune and the production. And the live version is, there's things fighting for your ears' attention. Let me say that. Cool to hear everybody doing their thing on it, but there's a lot of conflict happening. Cool. Really, the main thing was it was just cool to hear what Eddie had come up with for guitar parts for it, and clearly was doing a lot of improvisation and having fun, playing up, behind the beat in some places and right on top of the beat in other places, and dancing all over the song while dancing all over the fretboard. It was kind of cool. Let's see. Because of the band's "Let's Get Wasted and Fuck" image, it's been hard for people to hear as opposed to who else? As opposed to what other long-haired hard rock band of the last 15 years, boys? Come on. It's been hard for people to hear those songs or Roth's vocal range. Guys get a falsetto that sounds like Janis Joplin. Even when the proof is right there in the black plastic grooves, I'll Wait, to stick with one example, must be the first time they've ever sung about delayed gratification. That's not something we've aspired to, no. But if you listen to the song, it's remarkably sensitive, dealing with one of Roth's favorite themes, whether in lyrics or in interviews: image versus reality. In this case, it's the image of a particular woman he's fallen in love with while wondering about the truth of her real personality. In Jungian terms, it's about the anima, a man's ideal woman, his female soul image. It's about the girl in the Calvin Klein underwear ad, says Roth, cutting loose with a long, low, wet laugh. You know, the one where she's wearing the guy's underwear? I cut her picture out of the newspaper, pinned it to the front of the Trinitron, and wrote the words to her. Any other poignant questions? The Trinitron. All right, fine. I'll look it up. What's a Trinitron? Oh, television. Oh, it's the old, yes, the ubiquitous. It's a Sony TV, I guess. And I mean, if you grew up in the 80s, hoo boy. Trinitron was Sony's brand name for its line of aperture grill-based CRTs used in television sets and computer monitors. It's got that look of like fake wood paneling and a sort of a. Sometimes it's got like this grill sort of look to, like some wedges in the side or whatever. I can't do it justice, but yeah. Just imagine a TV in the early 80s or 70s, and the edges are wood or fake wood, and there's a big old clunky dial on it to change the channels, and you know, it's small but bulky. Anyways, let's see. He says, how about the rest of the lyrics of 1984? I wrote them in the back of a 1951 Mercury lowrider. I'd call up Larry, the roadie. He'd show up after lunch. We'd hop in the car and go driving all through the Hollywood Hills, up the Coast Highway, through the San Fernando Valley. I'd sit in the back and write the words for whatever music I had on the cassette. Every hour and a half or so, I'd lean over the front seat and say, Larry, what do you think of this? He's probably the most responsible for how it came out. That's kind of cool. I like that idea. That's great. I wish I fucking hire someone to drive me through the Hollywood Hills in a 1951 Mercury. That's very nice. That's a very cool sort of mechanism for creativity. I dig it. Eddie comes by with a cassette and says, here's the riffs. Sing over them. We hear him in studio. We all put the material together. He has the music, the original 4 or 5 different parts. Yeah, that might be a good chorus. We'll play that just once, call it a B part. That'll be a verse there. Let's chop this up. We'll save this for another song. Once that process is completed, I get it on cassette and I call Larry. Not a primary creative force in the music beyond the lyrics, in which he claims no pride, Roth does seem to occupy a position of arbiter between Eddie and the public. He exercised veto power over Jump, the #1 single in the country for 5 weeks, for 2 years before agreeing to sing it. Man, there is so much music, so many snippets of good riffs and bad riffs. Who knows what is getting thrown out after a while? I don't remember from 2 years ago. Maybe it wasn't right for 2 years ago. We hear all these bits and pieces, and then we have to sift through them. We can't possibly put everything on the album. Jump made it there eventually. One thing critics have not accused Roth of is pretension. The music is so much Sturm and Drang. The whole parade is so much Sturm and Drang. Chaos and hysteria. It becomes so much larger than life. I keep waiting for it to bust. Here you have a road crew of 75 people, 100 tons of equipment, 9 semis, 5 buses, all to support what? We're not selling soap here. We're selling the Four Stooges, 4 guys pounding away at the simplest instruments, playing the most simple songs, falling down occasionally. It's a mockery of the whole corporate process. All the personalities, the agents, the promoters, the managers, the newspaper critics, the groupies, the truck drivers, they're all like cartoon characters. I look at it like that, like a cartoon. You're going to have a good time. Oh, I take it back. If you look at it like that. Not I look at it like that. So, yeah. Other than that, any questions? Any stuff we didn't?
Yeah, what about just, if you don't have an answer, that's fine. But,
I won't.
Guitar tone-wise,
Yeah.
like from album to album, do you have a favorite overall tone? Do you feel like they were very similar? Do you feel like they're very different?
Yeah, I feel like they're really similar. I'm as a guitarist and very satisfactory. All three of them. I don't. I mean, I notice little differences in the mix, but not in a way that distracts my ear, and not in a way that makes me enjoy them less. I think the production, with all the changes and the tweaks to their tones and their production and stuff, none of it detracts from the songwriting. If the songs were good, which they are, then it doesn't matter too much. The production has to be kind of bad to mess up that experience. So for this three, I'm sure I will probably be in the minority of the people that get interviewed, but I don't feel like there's a great big difference between the three when it comes to the tones, except the bass, because the bass pops out more with like a flanger on it and stuff on 2 and 3. But nah, if every Van Halen album I ever heard sounded like one of these three, I'd be pretty happy with it.
Cool. Right on. And then did you want to talk about any of the other, you talked about Dave a bunch. Do you have any, things to say about the rhythm section or? Yeah,
it's a super unconventional rhythm section in that, like, Alex does a lot of pushing and pulling, and so does Eddie. And I think that is more their rhythm. And it's Michael Anthony being as straight down the middle as he can as a bassist and sort of living between the two of them. There's now, in the YouTube era and the isolated tracks era, now there are videos where, like, someone recently did I quantized a Van Halen song and let's hear how awful it sounds, because it wasn't meant to be quantized. They sound the way they do. You don't notice that there's changes in time, and if you grew up hearing the stuff and you're used to it, but people now that would put it on a microscope could see that wavering off of the beat. But because the band sort of expands and contracts their approach to the rhythms in individual ways, it's not that noticeable, and it doesn't really throw you off. It doesn't mess up your listening experience. If it did, somebody would have stopped them and made them record with a click track, obviously.
Right.
They did have that technology in 1976.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I can't say enough great stuff about Alex Van Halen or Michael Anthony, but I don't play their instruments, so I don't have a lot of insight. It's just one of those. Everyone knows Michael Anthony's the unsung hero of Van Halen, especially with his vocals. Especially he doesn't do anything acrobatic on the bass, but if he did, you wouldn't hear it anyway. Compare with Eddie and Alex doing their thing. There's no way you're gonna. So the best way to actually get noticed is to be rock solid and simple, and then contribute to those amazing angelic vocals that fill out the choruses so nicely.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, yeah, other than that, I mean, that was pretty much it, except for your perfect 10.
Yes, I had one.
And then if you had any, I don't know if you had any other Van Halen stories or.
I have none. I have no Van Halen stories. I have no involvement in, like, meeting anyone connected to the band or anything. I don't have any. I never got to see them live. But there was. I think I have one note about a specific solo. I didn't want to forget. Oh, it was back to Call Me a Doctor, the car noises, then a solo that employs everything great about Eddie Van Halen. Fast percussive picking to start with, then a lot of tapping in the middle, tapping, hammer-oning, biddly 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 stuff for the non-guitar player that doesn't know what tapping is. The invention he had when he, according to an interview I read, he had seen Led Zeppelin live, and he saw Jimmy Page playing one-handed, pulling off, to an open string, diddle 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 diddle, just using the sort of inertia there, the momentum of your own fingers to do the tap and the pull off to make those notes happen. And he thought, well, how would you do that if you're not in the open position? How would you do that without a capo? How would you, and that's what he started doing. He started just adding another hand to it, and supposedly building it out from there. So then the middle of the solo has that. But he keeps moving from, like, technique to technique, and he jumps from that into this crescendo with these chord tones in the high octaves. Again, like I would equate to a Chet Atkins or Les Paul kind of thing. And then, again, I could be wrong, but And then when he runs out of high notes on the fretboard, he starts hitting high notes on the harmonics. He covered everything in one solo for a song that's not even one of their best known Van Halen songs. It's just that, again, the composition, the awareness of how to construct something. And I think a recent interview with David Lee Roth on Joe Rogan's podcast, he did talk about this very thing, not that solo, but how guitar players create solos in the studio now is not what Eddie Van Halen did. He said Eddie Van Halen did all this stuff. He would orchestrate these solos piece by piece meticulously and create these dynamics that built up to something intentionally. And now, digitally, guitarists just play a bunch of solos and then they chop up with Pro Tools. And it's not like I'm bringing any revelations here to anyone in this audience, I'm sure. But to the average audience, that is sort of a revelation. That is sort of there was a lot more considered sort of steps in place to build up. We're going to create tension, we're going to release the tension, or we're going to, do all these different things while showing off and putting every other guitar player to shame at the time. So.
Always.
Yep. Back to the Musician Magazine feature on David and Eddie. The last comment from David was about treating life in the band and on the road as a cartoon. They say there's more than a cartoon going on here. Dave says, let me tell you something. Somebody asked me, Dave, what's it mean when you say somebody's rocking or when somebody's not rocking? I say, I'll illustrate. A guy with black socks, black shoes, blue and white Bermuda shorts, Hawaiian luau shirt, a Nikon, and a jackknife around his neck, zinc oxide on his nose, a pair of sunglasses, a fishing hat with all the badges on it, and he's staring up at the tall buildings. That's rock and roll. Now, the freedom to do that is very serious, but the picture is a crack up. There you go, folks. Teach your kids that, whatever that lesson was. And this is important because a lot of musician readers are looking for the secret formula of rock and roll. Some attitude, some piece of equipment, some article of clothing that will make them a star. Roth has just given away the game. To rock and roll, one must be a nerd. Breaking the general rhythm of the interview, Roth doesn't laugh. I'm primarily motivated by fear and revenge. My songs, my interviews, the way I dress, every time we play, I'm dancing someone into the dirt. There's nothing to give away. The music is a matter of luck. It's magic. If you could duplicate it, there would have been a whole lot more Beatles. Good point. That's a good one. All I can do is answer questions that have nothing to do with the music, try to illustrate where it comes from. People can judge whatever they want. Oh, well, that's an interesting way to live your life. Perhaps if I tried that, I wouldn't play all sad songs for a change. You know how often I hear that? 98% of people who pick up an acoustic guitar think that means sad. I'm no teacher, but I say, hey, have you tried anything a little more positive? Why don't you try to take a sad subject and win for a change? All I can do is tell stories, make funny asides. You can't explain the music, only the people it comes from. The most that's another good one. I like that. See? I'm not being overly judgmental for no reason with Dave. I'll give it to him. The most exciting thing to anybody. Yeah, that's the sentence. You can't explain the music, only the people it comes from. The most exciting thing to anybody, period. It seems to me ought to be to know. It's typo, I guess. This is by the way, I don't know if I gave the source. This is the tapesarchive.org. So it's been pulled from another source and printed. It's been published here digitally, and apparently nobody went through the text with a fine-tooth comb to check on formatting issues and problems with the punctuation. And you get to hear it all in real time, folks, because that's what you pay for. Let's see. Have I told you how much I love sleeping on my new Radish mattress? Radish mattresses are 100% organic and biodegradable and great for heavy sleepers, light sleepers, people that sleep too hot or too cold. Radish mattress. Mattresses for life. There. That's how we pay the bills. The most exciting thing to anybody, it seems to me, ought to be to know whether another person's personality, whether it's your wife, your boyfriend, politician, rock star, ball player, doesn't matter. There's always somebody else. There's always somebody else. Ought to be to know another person's personality, the most exciting thing to anybody. Okay, whoever they are, it doesn't matter. There's always somebody. What does there's always somebody else mean? One personality Roth seems uninterested in knowing better is Eddie Van Halen. The situation appears similar to the mid-period Who, when the tensions and creativity seem to reach an optimum balance, enough to keep passion on the music, but not enough to destroy the band. Their quotes hint at deep wounds, Eddie omitting Roth from his list of deep humans. Roth portraying their show as the Four Stooges with no credit for Eddie's artistry, yet neither is willing to pull the scabs off in public. Two different personalities, Roth mutters. Two different worlds. Two completely different worlds. One difference in the worlds is that Eddie doesn't have that much money. It depends on what you do with it once it crosses your palm. He's got a great new studio. How many tracks is it? Nice microphones. Pretty floor. All those little pieces of wood that just fit right together all the way to that big door. I don't got that. Roth's tone drops a reeking load of sarcasm on Eddie's temple to his muse. What does Roth got? A bathing suit. I choose to wear it in Tahiti more often than not. But as far as material possessions go, I own a bathing suit. There's been money made. Making it's the easy part. Keeping it is the whole ball game. It's like jumping. Going up is easy. I can teach you that in 20 minutes. Going down, it'll take you 3 years. Back on the subject of being more exciting, of nothing being more exciting than getting to know another personality, who was the first to make such an impression on Roth? Al Jolson. What? Al Jolson. He was doing something completely off the wall. He had a great voice, a lot of conviction, determination. A show that shook the world. White Gloves to this day are the hottest thing going. Each song created a different feeling, a different mood. Showbiz, glamour, big-time stage with velvet curtains and glitz and all the razzmatazz. And it was just old country-type bluesy rural shit. I learned all his greatest hits by the time I was 7. And ever since I've known that I would make music on stage. Roth snuffs out a cigarette and rasps a Jolson medley. You Made Me Love You, Toot Toot Tootsie, Dixie Melody, Sonny Boy. There's a rainbow on my shoulder. Not really an over that has created a lot of different moods and feelings, but it did create one feeling very well. Joy, like a Van Halen show. Joy for teenagers. A celebration of the physical. No, I'll sync it up for you exactly. I am primarily motivated by fear and revenge. What? Fear and revenge. You'll find it in all my presentations, my songs, my interviews, the way I dress, the way I walk down the street. Granted the fabulous success of 1984, but we've had our problems with management, accountants, lawyers, all the attendant things you come with working your way out of the bar scene. People think this has to be paradise, but I'm telling you, these thorns linger with you. And you pluck them out one at a time with each success. You're number one. You can pull this one out of your shoulder. You know, that son of a bitch. It's part of arriving. Every time we go out and play, yeah, I'm having a great time, but I'm also dancing someone else into the dirt. Such feelings inspire a counterload of guilt in most people. I'm not even going to plead nolo contendere. Not guilty, Judge Wapner. Life is one big party, and it's our duty to dance. Now, there's plenty more to this Musician magazine article that I'm going to save for later. Now there's there's a scene where Tommy jumps out the back window of his girlfriend's house. His girlfriend played by Janie Wright. And he's peeping on her while she's changing. And, we get to see what he sees, and it's very nice. And does the, like, I'm going to scream and my parents are going to come get you if you don't get out of here right now. She screams, and he jumps out the window and gets in his car and drives away very fast to the tune of what, for the longest time, I didn't know was actually Van Halen playing, because it's the exact same track as was used in Back to the Future when Marty McFly as Darth Vader in a radiation suit puts the headphones on George McFly, wakes him up in the middle of the night, and like he's using a stun gun on him, he plays Van Halen sounding guitar music into his ears. Lots of squeals and dive bombs. And it took many, many years, and after the internet came around, for me to find out, yes, that was Van Halen, just not really technically credited as a contributor to the soundtrack on Back to the Future. I want to say a quick thanks to you for being here and listening to all my unused guitar demos that go into these episodes. No, that's not high fidelity. It's all stuff recorded with a Zoom device in my living room while you can still hear me picking on the actual strings nearby the microphone a little too close. And even if that one was definitely a rip on Danzig's How the Gods Kill, I'm still glad you heard it anyway. Life is weird. It could be over at any moment, and I could be gone tomorrow. So I'm just glad somebody gets to hear my creative output in the form of the music, the narration, and the delivery and the editing of these shows. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Earlier in the Van Halen series, we read some quotes from Mr. Michael Anthony from an interview with Chris Gill and or Brad Tolinski, and I want to go into a part 2 of that in the same book. I will pretty much just keep it to reading his actual quotes. I don't want to read like a word-for-word interview back and forth. I think it's not as dependent upon that dynamic to get the point of what Michael Anthony is saying as it is with a David Lee Roth interview or an Eddie Van Halen interview, where there's clearly commentary on the actual question being formed and the provocation of it, etc. They mention a more radio-friendly sound for Van Halen around 84, and he says it wasn't really a conscious effort. We never said, hey, we need to write a big hit song, or we should try this formula. Ed just wrote what he felt, and we played along. He said, we'd always laugh when we'd hear about bands that did all these elaborate overdubs in the studio. We were always in the mindset of, if we can't play this live, then why should we record it? Let's record it how it's going to sound when we play it live, because we don't want to have to hire musicians. On the second album, we loosened up a little. We would add a little extra rhythm track here or whatever, but it wasn't anything that we couldn't cover live. Playing with Sammy was completely different than Dave, so our sound changed. Sam had a greater understanding of songwriting from a guitar perspective, because he's a pretty solid player. Where Dave would go, hey, what if, and sing something, Sammy would go, hey, what if, and pick up a guitar and play something. He had that musical sense and knowledge about how we could take an arrangement further. Maybe that's probably why a lot of the stuff started to sound more song-oriented and less of a jam. Van Halen's songs were always written around licks that Ed would come up with. If you took the vocal away from it, especially with Dave, you could still get away with just listening to the music because every song was almost written like an instrumental. A lot of times, it would just be Ed, Alex, and myself jamming in the rehearsal room or whatever. And Ed would break into a rhythm, and we would sort of figure out where the vocals would go. When we were done, we would say, "Okay, Dave, put some words to it." He talks about Sammy knowing more about song structure because he had been doing his thing. We felt he elevated the band. When the question of certain producers comes up, Ted Templeman versus Mick Jones and the 5150 sessions, he said, "We needed and wanted the outside opinion. We would always say that if it was left to us, each of our songs would be about 10 minutes long and it'd take us about 3 years to record an album. You know, each song would have a 5-minute guitar intro before the band would come in." Mick Jones, who I believe produced Foreigner, really helped a lot as far as the song structure and stuff like that. We learned a lot from Ted, though. He was great at identifying parts that would work or seeing potential in cover materials. For example, we used to play the song "You're No Good" in the clubs, and Ted would say, "Man, that could be a hit again." Or when Ted insisted on us doing "Dancing in the Street," none of us really were into doing it, but it was a hit for us. And they bring up Andy Johns being a little bit wilder and more like a band member for Van Halen. And Mike says, "Well, he was great for me on a personal level. I loved Don Landy as an engineer, but he was used to working with people like Linda Ronstadt and the Doobie Brothers, who used a rounder, more subliminal bass sound. On most of his records, you could feel the bass, but the bass players didn't have their own sound. There was no identity. Personally, if you don't immediately sort of get a thought in your head of what he's referring to, I would say listen to some Motown, listen to some R&B. That's the bass tone he's talking about. It's not present. It's not calling attention to itself. It's moving, but it's soft and it's sort of round as opposed to a spiky or more treble-y, more present bass tone that kind of pokes through. Especially when it deviates from what the kick drum's doing or what the guitar is doing, you really notice a sharpness in certain kinds of hard rock, heavy metal bass. Great example of that. If you want to compare and contrast what he's talking about to a more modern bass sound, there's a million examples, but the one that my brain goes to because I was 14 when it came out and it was on MTV a lot, Jet City Woman by Queensryche. Listen to that bass tone. It's right there on the intro. You only have to listen for like 10 seconds and you'll know what I mean. That's a more present, less subliminal bass tone. He says he clicked with Andy almost instantly because for the first time we had a producer that cared about my sound. Suddenly it was like, "Mike, have you ever tried reamping your bass?" And I was like, "No, what's that?" The next thing I knew, I was like, "Oh, fuck. You can actually hear me." It was almost shocking. I loved Andy to death, man. We had the best time working with him on For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, and I thought it was a great record and a great sounding record. He helped us get our edge back. Reamping is basically, you plug your instrument, your bass, your guitar, your keyboard, whatever, into, let's say, an amplifier through a splitter box, maybe, like a little junction thing where there's a jack and then there's one in and a couple of outs. You can take a cable out to your amplifier to get the normal sound you're used to. You can put a microphone in front of that amplifier and you can record it as you play. But then you take the other side of that splitter, that other output, and you put it into the mixing desk, the recording console itself, and you save that signal untouched by your amp. Or you just go straight in and you record without an amp. And then on subsequent playbacks, you route that signal. You turn the volume up on that part of the mixing board and the console, and in between the knobs and the final sort of, let's say, tape with quotes, hard drive or whatever, you have it going through another amplifier after you've recorded it. You don't have to commit to whatever it was your first choice was. and you can add compression and other sort of dynamic-based effects and decide over a longer period of time what you want it to sound like. Unlike usually with guitar players, you find a sound in the room, you play your favorite amps or a couple of them, you put microphones on 2 or 3 different amps, record them all at the same time, and then kind of mix around with them later on. A lot of bass tones can be drastically changed, during the mixing process after you're done. You've done your parts, you've done the homework, you've performed them exactly the way that you want them to, and the producer is happy with, and the band is happy with, and then you get to futz around with the tone of it after the fact. He goes on to say, Alex was a huge Led Zeppelin fan. He always loved John Bonham's snare sound, and he chased that tone forever. The biggest fight he would get into with our producers would be about his snare sound. He'd bring in a copy of Stairway to Heaven and say, I want that. So he flipped when Andy brought in one of his snares that Bonzo had used. Oh, my gosh. I mean, that's like, if you're into sword fighting and someone's like, hi, this is King Arthur's, like it's not Excalibur, but it's one of the swords that King Arthur fought people with, this is the sword that he chopped up the Black Knight with, maybe. I forget. I haven't seen that documentary, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, in a long time. I forget if it was Arthur that chopped up the Black Knight, and historically, I believe. History Channel won't talk about that. So he flipped when Andy brought in the snares that Bonzo had used. Most of our recording sessions would end with us sitting around Andy like little kids at a campfire while he would tell us Zeppelin stories. He talks about how Al had his own very identifiable drum sound. People take it for granted, but most other drummers sound like they're hitting a piece of paper compared to him. His sound always has body and tone. Sometimes it was a pain in the ass for me. Both Al and Eddie had such big sounds, it was difficult to fit the bass in. That means that, like, in the mix of your album, if there's a lot of low end bass response in the drum sound, and then plenty of like thick, low mid range, in the guitar sound like Eddie would have, there's only so much you can do with a bass guitar tone to poke through that or to support it without being overlooked by the human ear. I hope that makes sense. But, you fight for frequencies. Every instrument has only a certain amount of frequencies. A good example is Metallica's And Justice for All. Lars Ulrich openly said in a magazine in 1991, what happened with that album was James took all the frequencies and said, they're mine, and put them on the rhythm guitar. And that left very little for everybody else. So the bass guitar on that album is pretty much inaudible, and the drum sound is very bright. It's very snappy, and it's very controlled. It's not echoing. It's not ringing. There's no reverb hardly on it. It's very tight, very tight. Not a lot of. Compare that to like Soundgarden's Super Unknown record, which is like a band playing in a garage. Like there's so much mids and body to the tone of the instruments, including the snare drum and the kit in general, and the guitars. And there's a lot of room. There's a lot of room, breathing room for all the instruments, I feel like, on that one. Which is great because they're not playing as many notes as they were on Bad Motorfinger. So when you play lots of notes like you do on And Justice for All, you got to cut down on the frequencies. You got to cut down on how much warmth there is, how much ringing, roomy sound there is. It's not a freaking Americana album from the early 2000s where there's, a really sensitive microphone in a living room, with a couple acoustic guitars and an acoustic drum set. So he goes on to talk about working with Bruce Fairbairn. He says he didn't have the impact Andy did. We sort of knew that we wanted to sound. We knew what we wanted to sound like by balance. By that time, you knew what you wanted to sound like. I mean, that's like one of your last records ever. Well, it is for Michael Anthony, right? I feel like there's a bad choice of words there. Like he should have said, we knew what we wanted to sound like on balance. Like they had a very distinct sound they wanted, I guess. Some of our producers were just babysitters, but we would always try new people because we'd be curious to see how different producers heard us. They asked what he thinks of Ed's relationship with engineer Don Landy. It seems like they took over for a while, him and Ed, on 84 and OU 812. Michael says there were times when we'd record something and finish up for the day, and then everybody would go home. And then the next day you come in and everything would be different. Ed and Don would just go into studio all night and change everything around. It worried me a bit when I'd leave for a day and go, man, this is sounding really good, while thinking, oh my God, I hope nothing gets erased by the time I come back in tomorrow afternoon. It used to really irk Sammy, too. It would have bothered anybody. It certainly bothered the guys in Black Sabbath, or it bothered Dio, anyways. When Tony Iommi and their producer would pull his vocals down and erase things, or vice versa. I forget who it was. It was like they were both accusing each other of erasing the previous day's takes or messing with the mix, because like one half of the interested parties would be there in the day and the other half would be there late at night. I know that's not Van Halen, but you know, early 80s stuff. I think it was specifically on like not just Live Evil, but Mob Rules, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I should go back and consult my own episode of A History of Rock and Roll and Film and Rock and Roll covering the movie Heavy Metal, which features a bit of history on the Dio era Black Sabbath. Maybe I will. I'm probably not going to do that. He says, on some level, 5150 was great because we had our own place. No, he means the studio, not the album. And we could do what we wanted and come and go as we pleased. Ed always left the gear on 24/7 so you could go and mess around anytime. But I lived about a good 45 minutes away, so it's not like I would go, hey, yeah, I'm going to go up in the studio in the middle of the night. And Ed, though, could walk right up and up his driveway and be there. After a while, it became a bit of a curse because Ed got too comfortable there. On occasion, we wanted to go into another studio to record vocals just for a change of scenery, but that almost never happened. That's where some of the drama came in, but I don't want to rehash all of that. The interviewer notes he was sort of a John Paul Jones of the band, and how his policy in Led Zeppelin was to simply stay clear when things got weird with substance abuse or personality issues. Mike says, yeah, Ed and Al would call me Switzerland because I'd try to stay neutral. When things would get heated, I would often think to myself, why is this argument even happening? It doesn't need to be happening. My goal was to do the best job I could do. I didn't like the fighting. I tried to stay out of the fray because if I said anything, it would just be one more cook in the pot. That's not the expression, Michael. You fool. Ha! I've now become a better person than Michael Anthony because I've corrected his grammar, his terminology, his vocabulary. It's cooks in the kitchen, not cooks in the pot. I don't know. Maybe that's his thing. Maybe he trademarked that too many cooks in the pot catchphrase, and I'm not aware of it. He says it would make any given argument last even longer. It's being exaggerated how contentious the arguments were. Things would get heated, but most of the time we were able to take a step back and remember what it was we were trying to do before we started to overthink things. Then they say, but eventually you and the Van Halen brothers parted ways. Was the fallout due to Ed's substance abuse, or was there something deeper? And good man Michael Anthony says, without really getting into it, there were times when somebody had to be blamed for something, and whether or not I had anything to do with it, they would blame me. And for the life of me, I wouldn't know why. But it was probably because of the problems somebody else was having. Let's do a second take on that. It was probably because of problems somebody else was having. All right, take 3. It was probably because of problems somebody else was having. Use take 3, please. Towards the end, it wasn't even about music. I blame our manager, Ray Daniels, for Sammy leaving the band. Oof. Or being kicked out, depending on who you talk to. I remember Sammy telling him, hey, you do what you do, and you let me do what I do. Ray was the one that started the rift between Ed and Sammy. He created the bad blood. When you work with people, and they keep saying the same things, and keep drilling it and drilling it and drilling it, you start thinking, wow, maybe they're right. Or we should be doing this or that. And that's as far as I'll go with that. Well, Michael, I think you shouldn't have said that much then, buddy. I think you should have not named names if you're not going to provide specific examples, buddy. But whatever. I feel like that just makes me a little suspicious of his story. I can see being in his position, though, and wanting to put the word out to other people that, like, Ray Daniels is not to be trusted. I get that. If it protects other bands from going through what they went through. But, man, Eddie had a lot of shit to say about Sammy after the fact, and Sammy had a lot of shit to say about Eddie after the fact. So I don't think all that was planted by one guy. They ask about the time when Gary Sharon was in the band. And Mike says, it was a very tumultuous time. We actually did a couple of group therapy sessions with Dallas Taylor, who used to play drums with Crosby, Stills, and Nash & Young, and became a counselor. We had heard bands like Aerosmith went through therapy and used it to air their problems. It was interesting. But the most difficult period was the 2004 reunion tour with Sammy. That was like a trip to hell. It was a very dark time in Ed's life. I never thought that what I was doing could really be considered work, but that was work. Final question from this section here is them asking Michael if he had any opportunities to resolve his conflicts with Ed before he died. Michael says, not really. There are still a few issues I wish I could have talked about. A couple years ago, 2018, our manager, Irving Azoff, called me about doing a reunion. I knew Ed was ill, but they told me that he was going through some treatments, and after he was finished, he would be good to go. I guess Ed got too ill. I don't know the whole story, but it would have been great to tour with the band again. All the money aside, I would have loved to have done it, just to have been able to jam with those guys and talk with them like we used to. Now, to give you a window into the mind of Mr. David Lee Roth, I'm going to read directly from the very beginning of his book, Crazy from the Heat, because I want you to know what I was dealing with as a researcher, and I want you to know what Van Halen was dealing with as band members. So this came out in 1997. It is dedicated at the beginning to the friend of his or whoever it was that encouraged him to write the book. And then it says, a super ultra hyper special thanks to Paul Scanlon, who whittled this monster manuscript down from 1,200 pages to the gem you now hold in your hands. You are an amazing editor, a stellar spirit, and now a good friend. I wonder if they still are. This book is, I guess, 440 pages down from 1,200. So there was a very concerted effort to make this as coherent and on track as possible. And yet, you're gonna you're gonna get a taste of the best they could do. For page 1, I'm always hurting. Hurt my back. Somebody says, getting a little older? I says, I wish. I've hurt since day one. Not 3 days of my life have gone by in professional music for 20 years that I didn't have a toe that was screwing around with me, a knee that was ungrateful, a backache that threatened catastrophe. Gets very quiet at that moment. You're inside your knee. You go, fuck you, knee. I work with you all these seasons. Here we are on stage here, and you just give up on me? Knee says, no, man. You just did 14 nights in a row. I'm going home. I go, fuck you. I have Motrin. I started jumping around on the Van Halen stage in 1979 at the Oakland Coliseum. I didn't have my regular platform shoes, and I borrowed some Capezio dance shoes from somebody and just started flipping around. All those kicks, by the way, are designed for a specific reason. When they banned weapons throughout the Orient, all these martial arts really blossomed. So when you see the jump spinning back kick, that's designed to knock somebody off a horse. We did some sequential photography with a strobe light where you see multiple images, and they had a ballerina as my stand-in for all the test shots, and she made a nice, graceful, curved arc. When I jumped, it went straight up and straight across. It looked like it sounded. It was savage. It took so many hundreds of hours of preparation to be able to pull that out of my hat. How you doing, everybody? I'm not saying that he's incoherent. Not at all. He's actually very compelling, but he's so stream of consciousness. He provides no context for he's like inside. He talks about being inside his knee, and then he starts talking about when he first started jumping around on stage. And we did some sequential photography with the strobe. Who's we, and when was this, and what was this for? Was this for the album cover liner sort of photos and stuff? Where anyway. He says, I know the floorboards of every major arena, stadium, and venue in the free world, from bending over to stretch and stare at the floor for hours at a time before every show. My feet hurt constantly. I would sit in the doorway of the tour bus, and we wouldn't have any water, so Big Ed, my assistant, would pour Perrier on my feet, and I'd patch up all the blisters. All those moves were not gymnastics. They were martial arts, and I approached them with that discipline. See, that could have been connected to the part about the martial arts earlier, and we could have put the blisters and the floorboards part after that, I think. I approached them with that discipline. They had to be very real. As a result, well, dancers and acrobats doing it is very real as well, Dave. As a result, every day something would snap. I broke my foot doing the big split jump that's on the back cover of the second Van Halen album. I was jumping off a drum riser onto cement, and I snapped a bone. Inside is a picture of me in a cast with a cane. That's how I sang Somebody Get Me a Doctor in the studio. I went to Jack Curran, the trainer for the Los Angeles Lakers, and learned how to tape up my feet like a ball player. I constantly have shin splints. I was in pain, but I romanticized it as my equivalent of a guitarist's bleeding fingers. Now I know my engine inside and out. Not to say I don't floor it and drive it off into the hay on more than a frequent occasion, but for showtime, you can't eat 6 to 7 hours in advance, which usually means by 2:30 in the afternoon, you're dangerously low in blood sugar. So you balance that out with some amino acids. Watch the smoking, warm up, do scales in the bathroom. Took a lot of singing lessons. It didn't really assist in my sound, but I never lost what I got. And on and on. It's like being the trainer for Secretariat. I'd always push myself to the point of major exhaustion. Would come off stage so dehydrated we'd have to have paramedics there. And they would have to bag me while I ate dinner. I'd sit there with 3 saline tubes in my arms while I ate. I'd be so dehydrated, I'd clench up, or oxygen on the side of the stage, what have you. I took great pride that I could max it so hard that I would pass out. One night in Memphis, I smashed a guitar on stage, and a piece flipped up, and that's why I have this scar under my eye. Finished the show, and they band-aided me up. Everybody was gagging. I finished the show, walked to the stage, passed out. When I woke up, I was on a bed in the emergency room. They didn't want to wake me up, so the call sheet was sitting on my chest. Under the occupation, the nurse had written, circus performer. That could have used some more detail. What artery did he hit that he was gushing that much blood? I mean, how big was they put a Band-Aid on it and he finished the show? Like, what was the wound like? Ultimately, to test all this martial arts theory, I joined up with Benny Urquidez, Benny the Jet, kickboxing full contact. It was in 82. And I did the full contact training 5 mornings a week, plus road work, my first experience running. Now I can run the marathon. Then I ran 6 blocks and felt like throwing up. Got in the ring 6 times. Some of the old road crew would come down and cheer me on. It was glorious. I had the time and the wherewithal to invest in serious training, so I was always a little bit ahead of the curve. But I played in front of 375,000 people at the US Festival in pain. My knee was killing me. If you look at the pictures, I had a piece of something wrapped around my knee. Sometimes I wonder if this was not like a defensive maneuver metaphysically, an unwillingness to go forward, or provide myself with sufficient distraction that I could burn calories in that area as opposed to just being nervous about a show. Half my calories would go to my knee. What? I just feel like this is what makes Dave Dave. You know, like if you were in the room there would be an impulse to like stop him and, you know, have him explain the details of where before he jumps to something else, or make him backtrack and explain something. And it's like Blutarsky and Animal House screaming about how the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor and you know, Otter or whoever it is stops the other guy from interrupting him. It's like, stop, just let him go. He's on a roll. I guess this is the most positive version of that if you're a fan of David. I mean, the most negative version is like an Alex Jones type. And I've listened to way too much of that guy talking via the Knowledge Fight podcast, which I highly recommend. If you want to hear somebody basically analyze and debunk everything Alex Jones does over the course of 900 episodes. So he goes on to talk about this nose injury he sustains. I'm not even going to read. I'm not even reading you like the whole thing. Like I'm skipping over some paragraphs now. He talks about this shoot they're doing at the Piper Club in Rome. It looked like all those early 60s movies with very low ceilings and old pipes. They were shooting us for a television show. One of those ready, steady, go kind of pop shows. We do a couple run-throughs because it's going to be for live television. I determined the best way to go is they start off with black. The lights are off. You count uno, two, tres, and I would jump up, and the lights would come on while I was in midair. So we run through it a couple of times. There's this big mirror ball about 15 feet above my head. Everything works beautifully. We get ready, going to shoot it for real now. Stage is pitch black. We're waiting for a live feed, so it's 38 seconds in the dark. Nobody tells me that they're lowering the mirror ball until it's like 7 feet off the deck. I get down in the crouch, and I'm ready. I'm all hunched up on the floor, and they say, 1, 2, 3, go. The lights come on, and I launch myself skyward. Do you know that feeling when catastrophe is unavoidable and everything goes in slow motion and you're just like an innocent bystander watching it all happen? My nose saw the ball first and said in very slow motion, "Hey, ball." And the ball said, "Hey, nose." Cut instantly back into full-time fast reel motion. Bam! I just crunched my nose big time. Slammed into it full speed ahead. Come down on the stage with my head in my hands, bleeding all over the place, had to discontinue the shoot. They put me in the car, rush off to the main general hospital in Rome, which is like, I don't know, what occupied Allied forces. No, which is like, I don't know what Allied occupational forces. Quotes, quickly, boil some water and bring me some fresh towels, unquote. Complete with the gurneys and big wheels from all your favorite war movies. Yeah, things over in Europe didn't change. Those things were around for a long time. It's not like America, where they bulldoze every building every 10 years and put up a fucking Walmart. Or a Borders Books, which is where this book came from by the sticker on the cover. Doctor greets me in a private room. He's wearing the surgeon smock, which goes down below his knees, and he's supposed to wear it backwards. Drawstring in the back, right? He's wearing it front ways, and he's got no undershirt on, so he looks like me with his chest hair poking out. He's got a plunging neckline. He's smoking a cigarette. He puts a cigarette in his mouth, and he tilts my head. He looks at the nose. He oohs and ahs, and he goes, "Okay, absolutely, he needs surgery immediately. We check him into the hospital right now. I do surgery. Everything's okay in maybe 6-7 days." I said, "I want a conflicting opinion." They bring in another little character right out of an Abel Ferrara movie. He looks, says, "You don't have to stay at the hospital. Surgery is not necessary. But I must pack the nose now. And absolutely, you come back every day for 4 days." I said, "I need another opinion." A third guy comes in, says, "Do nothing. Just rest." By now, my nose is swelled up as big as my thigh. Okay, gotta rest. It hurts to even move. So they pack my nose. They put bandages all over it to stabilize it. We were due to play what's called the Pink Pop Festival in Holland. It's about 65,000 people. I says, "Oh, man, I think we've got to cancel the Pink Pop Festival next week, and I'm hurting bad." Okay, downtime. Everybody's off. Gigs canceled. Everybody goes their own way for a week. I assume what he didn't explain there was like, out of 3 opinions, he just chose the middle one. The least extreme of the 3. I don't know. I got on a plane with Big Ed, and we went, again, that's his like handler guy, not Eddie Van Halen. And we went back to L.A. By now, the swelling's gone down. It hurts, but I'm used to that. And it's not long before we're roller skating down around Hermosa Beach. Well, actually, I'm working out. See, there's this pretty blonde who's got to be all of 17 that I would drag around. She would hang onto my sweater, tied around my waist, and I would roller skate. Got to stay in condition. I turned to Ed in the middle of a sunny afternoon 2 days later. I said, "How's my nose look?" Looks okay to me. I don't stop to think, Ed used to play semi-pro ball. His nose goes from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, depending on which side of his head you're standing near. I said, great. What's the last possible moment we could call our manager who's staying at the Sunset Marquis in Hollywood and still catch the last possible plane to make the Pink Pop Festival? He said, 4 o'clock. I said, what time is it? It's about 3. I said, great. Let me know when an hour's up. At 4 o'clock, we roller skated up to a phone booth, called the manager, and said, I can make it. Massive hysterical dash to put together the airplane flights, the visas. Phone calls are made. The trucks have got to get from Brussels to Holland, the whole thing. Now, okay, pausing again. Clearly an indication of his control issues. One of those guys that, like, he could have told everybody. I mean, if it happened the way he says it happened, that means he was very negligent and he wanted to spring this on everyone at the last possible minute and make it really, daring and exciting and maybe anxiety-inducing for everyone else but him. Instead of letting the band and the manager know, like, hey, I'm gonna be a really good boy for a few days and get my nose healed up and then wait for the word from me on Tuesday by 4 o'clock as to whether it's a go or not, But no, put it all together last minute for me because I want to make things dramatic. That's the thing. Dramatic people are dramatic people in their whole mode of operating. That's not. A lot of folks are quite taken with that personality when it's entertaining them. Not so much after some infidelity and some car crashes and some screaming and yelling and throwing things around. I'm not saying Dave does that, but the more destructive members of our society that are generally rewarded for being erratic and rewarded for being quite a bit more than, let's say, unconventional in their operations, let's say. People who just have to have things their way, and they have to intentionally make things harder for everyone else around them so that there can be as much of a dramatic atmosphere as possible, perhaps to make their band play in a more exciting, dramatic way. No matter who gets manipulated or abused.
Hi, John. Fuck you.
Now, what happens next? They, get on a plane. He steps off with big pieces of tape all over his nose. There's press at the airport waiting for them. They're delighted that we're going to make it. And so they're interviewing David and asking him what it is he's wearing on his face. They think it's some kind of fashion statement. He says, another time, another tour, there were these stitches over my eye, like a dozen. We had to fly to Europe immediately. The road manager was a cook. He had been through the Culinary Institute, and I figured, well, he's got the best hand. You're the one that's going to pull my stitches. There was no doctor to do it, and it was time. It had been 10 days. We were en route, so we were going to meet the press getting off the airplane. I said to him, Steve, you're the one. You got to do my stitches. He said, great. We got to sterilize the wound area. He's a cook. What else is he going to use but vodka? He treated the wound carefully, pulled out the stitches at 32,000 feet, somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this book is broken up in like that was most of the first chapter, but a lot of these are just like they have a title and it's like one-page story. It's just very random. Like the next one is just talking about hanging around outside of a Bob Marley concert. There's nothing to really take away from it, but he was flyering the cars outside. He stood outside the brick wall and listened to the whole concert. He decided he was going to smoke joints as big as Bob Marley someday. The next one is not even a full page, but it says, 2 strippers. I was with these 2 girls once. They were strippers up in Vancouver, Canada. They came up to me and said, Dave, we'd like to go upstairs, the 2 of us, with you. So I said, okay. We went upstairs, and it was August, and I was hot and sweaty and humid. It says I was, not it was. I assume that's a typo. And we commenced delivering the groceries at 138 beats a minute or more. I like that. Delivering the groceries. That's a fun euphemism. One of the girls had $1,500 in singles and 5s and 10s, her end of the week tips and pay and everything in her G-string. Nobody noticed, when the G-string came undone. Well, I noticed. Nobody noticed the money, floating around. I woke up at some point around dawn. The 2 of them were asleep, and all 3 of us were covered with money. Every square inch had a dollar bill pasted to it. All exposed skin. And there was nothing but The whole bed was covered with bills. Our bodies were covered with bills. There was bills in my underwear. Take a little picture of that. What? Take a little picture of that? I feel like that's like a failed sitcom catchphrase from like a Fonzie kind of character or something. Take a little picture of that. Little finger guns pointing at the Potsy character or whatever. Yeah, timely reference, I know. I mean, I've been around strippers after they get off of work, and they're not still wearing their they're not like walking around in their G-strings with money hanging out of them, going from, place to place. Generally. I'm more likely to believe that they, maybe they did a dance for him with the money in their G-strings as more of a recreation of the good time thing, or they were all getting festive and they threw the bills up in the air for fun and had sex and sweat all over them. But I don't know. There's just whatever. It's not like he's going on about, anything radical like the fucking temperature that melts steel beams or whatever. I'll give it to you, Dave. Fine, whatever. Let's hop back into the conversation with Ray Daniels, former manager of Van Halen. We last left off talking about how uncomfortable the unveiling of the Roth reunion was at the MTV Awards. The next question that comes at him is about Gary Cherone. On paper, the idea of getting Gary Cherone in the band was a good one. Extreme was sort of a mini Van Halen, and his voice actually had a similar timbre and range to Sammy's. You were his manager at the time. Did you feel it was obvious to recommend him? I wanted Gary to get an audition, but I would have been happier had we auditioned 2, 3, or even 5 people. I would have opened it up and tried to find whoever was the best, but it was Ed's decision. I thought that Gary should have had a legitimate shot at it. My biggest hope was that whoever they chose, they were going to pick somebody that they were going to get along with. I was tired of wearing a referee's jersey. What I did know was that Gary was a skilled songwriter, a great stage performer, and had a great work ethic. If Ed wanted somebody to stay past 7 p.m., that was Gary Cherone. He had also come out of a band where the guitar player was the dominant force, so he was used to somebody like Ed. Gary was the ultimate team player, and that's not something you can say about every lead singer. Asking about how their chemistry was, Ray says, if Ed liked you, he fell in love with you, and there was a honeymoon period, and that's when that's what happened. That's part of why Ed didn't want to try somebody else, but keep in mind, when they picked Sammy, they only tried Sammy. They didn't try 4 other guys. It was the same deal. That's not quite true. Ed toyed around with a few other options before they hired Sammy. I know he was interested in doing a record with multiple guest singers. Yes, and he talked about that before Gary. That came up again, but Al wasn't into it. How was the honeymoon period with Gary? Ed loved him and Al was okay with him, or he appeared to be okay with him. Nobody asked Michael. Whose idea was it to use Mike Post as the producer of Van Halen 3? It was an unusual choice. He was famous for writing television theme show music and not producing rock bands. I didn't know Mike Post. Eddie knew and liked the guy and decided it was a good idea. I knew it didn't come from the label. Once Ted Teppelman was gone, Van Halen had very little connection with their label. They did what they wanted to do. Ed called the shots. Mike Anthony intimated at this point Ed was basically looking for a yes man so he could do whatever it is that he wanted to do. Sorry, folks. Haven't had much caffeine yet today. I think that's fair. Van Halen 3 was essentially an Edward Van Halen solo album. He no longer had a singer that was going to fight him or disagree with him. And so Ed was going to do what he wanted to do, the way he wanted to do it. And Al would go along with things because Ed had his role and Al had his role. If you took Mike Post out of it and you put in a more experienced producer, maybe the record would have been different. I don't know. It's clear that Ed was not a fan of lead singers. Why didn't he just do a solo instrumental album? I don't think anyone would have encouraged him to do that. And if it wasn't within him to really want to do that, then it wasn't going to happen. He'd go from being Eddie Van Halen to Jeff Beck, and I don't think that interested him. All the guitar players would love it, and he'd still have a career, but that's not quite the same as being in Van Halen. You felt that he still desired to have that big-time recognition. Well, I think to him that was a given. He'd always been successful. He wanted the band to be successful. Eddie never wanted to fail. When he talked about the band becoming more credible or less of a party band, he never added, and I, of course, will sell less records because of that. That wasn't part of the plan. By the same token, he wasn't saying, and I want to do this because we'll then sell more records. That wasn't on the radar with him. It was just what he wanted to do. And I think that there was somewhat of an assumption that he would be successful because he'd always been successful. It's like Michael Jordan or Wayne Gretzky or any other great athlete who's never had a bad season. Their thinking is, of course I'm going to do well. Of course we'll make it to the playoffs. We may not always be number one, but we'll always be there. We're contenders. I think that was just a general assumption and not in an egotistical way. If you want to stretch the comparison, some athletes will move down the ranks, get less ice time or court time, and stick around as long as they can. And there's other guys that are a certain age, and they see the writing on the wall, and they leave while they're on top. In music, it's not so easy to do that because they don't force you out because you're 38. When Ed took control of Van Halen 3, was there any pushback? No. Al was generally supportive of Ed. Occasionally, you could tell Al had his reservations about some of Ed's decisions, but he was supportive and protective of his brother. If you took on one of those guys, you had to take on both. They were very much like that. But Al was not a cheerleader type guy. He was a realist. His attitude was usually something like, well, we'll wait and see. If this is successful, great. If not, then we'll talk about it, won't we? Al liked Gary. Al knew that Gary was a decent guy. Gary's fucking Joe Biden, okay? He just oozes integrity and decency. Well, I don't know if that statement stands up to the opinions of a large portion of the country of America right now. Even ones that aren't fans of the opposition for Biden. Anyways, I'm not going there. It seems like a silly, irresponsible statement to make from someone who's entirely convinced that there's only one way to see things politically. Anyways, Van Halen 3 sold well. Oh, and had Van Halen 3 sold well, we would have been sitting here talking about the 20th anniversary of Gary Cherone with Van Halen. He had the right aptitude to get along with Ed and Al. He had the work ethic, and Gary's not a troublemaker. If Gary was touched by your music, he was very affected by it. He had that ability to be a fan. Whether it was for Queen, Van Halen, or whatever else he was into, Gary was definitely excited by people's talent. He's the least narcissistic guy in the music business. Ed was very invested in Van Halen 3. He felt it was some of his best work. He must have been gutted when it didn't do well. He wasn't happy, is the only response. Was there any sense before it was released that the album wasn't going to do well? Nobody tells the artist that they don't think an album is great. When you're a big-name act, people generally tell you what they think you want to hear. Or they don't say anything, and the artist often doesn't notice the silence. And that's a big part of why you have a manager. The manager tries to filter some of that and gives the message to the artist, hopefully without trying to do the conquer and divide thing and turn the artist against people. I knew there was a lot of disappointment when they didn't reunite with David. And I knew there was going to be some people that didn't think Van Halen 3 was going to be great. Ed wasn't one of them. The first week it came out, it sold like 460,000 or 480,000, and that was terrific. And then the next week it didn't do so well. When MTV didn't pick up the video, I knew there was trouble. Well, they picked up the video. I've seen the video. I mean, we saw it on MTV at the time. I don't know what picked up mean. Maybe he means like heavy rotation after the first couple of weeks. But that wasn't the issue. It was just a symptom. The reality was that the word of mouth from fans wasn't good because the fall off was pretty dramatic. What did you think of the album? I was hoping it would be successful. That's not an answer. I mean, when you listen to it. In all honesty, I was caught up in Eddie's enthusiasm for it and Gary's hopefulness. But I wasn't getting feedback from anybody else. People were just telling me, why don't they just get David back? What was the obsession with Dave about? The business people thought that if Van Halen could sell 75% of what they sold with David using Sammy, then what would happen if you had David back? They felt the band could return to that level that they were at when they recorded 1984, right? Van Halen would go back to being the biggest band in America again. But the music world isn't that predictable. And they would discover that less than a decade later when Dave returned. 1984 was a moment in time and a combination of many factors. I don't think people gave Sammy Hagar the credit he deserved for how good he was and how he made Van Halen a different band. Sam was a big part of why those records sold. If you want to be Led Zeppelin and you don't sing, you have to find your Robert Plant, and that's what Van Halen is, the American version of Led Zeppelin. And Sammy was a great singer. I thought he was a much better singer than David Lee Roth was. On the other hand, I think David Lee Roth's lyrics were just fucking right place, right time, and very witty. The interviewer points out that Van Halen 3 had some amazing moments and isn't as bad as it's made out to be, and he agrees. But he also says, has anyone ever replaced a singer for the third time and had success? Interviewer says, I don't think so. It's a difficult feat. This doesn't get discussed, but there was a certain amount of fan fatigue surrounding Van Halen. You had serious David fans and serious Sammy fans, and both of those camps were upset when Gary was hired. Don't get me wrong, Ed was the central figure, but those guys had their fans as well. There was just too much commotion. It was annoying for fans. Ray says, yeah, you're right. To go test that a third time after they'd already brought David out for 2 songs on the Best Of record, and then here we were again. They needed it to do something brilliant, and that's not what happened. Gary, however, was really good live, and his version of some of the catalog songs were arguably the best that they had ever been performed live. And the response was good, but that didn't mean people were going to buy the current record. It was a lot to put on Gary's shoulders. Both singers were hard to follow because both of them were stars, and both of them had their era. I don't know what would have happened if Sammy never entered the picture. Who knows? Would they have kept it up, or did David depart at exactly the right time? In retrospect, bringing in Sam, who had better musical chops and was a better singer, was probably not a bad move. It actually proved to be a good thing. Do you think no matter who the singer was, Van Halen's decline was inevitable? Perhaps. Had they stayed with Sam, I doubt if their next record would have done as well as Balance. Eventually, most veteran bands don't sell as many tickets as they once did. They may still sell as many tickets because they're still playing Jump live, but there's an inevitable slow attrition when a band gets older and the fans get older. People will still make an effort to go see you, but they won't necessarily make an effort to go to Walmart or Peaches whenever record stores there were at the time and buy the record. You already had a divided fan base where everybody had picked the era they liked best. There were some people that liked both eras, but most gravitated to one over the other. Yeah, that's a good point. Wearing out your fan base, with a public battle, not good, not great. It splits things up. It makes things feel heavy instead of fun, and then you feel like, well, what's a good fan? What's a bad fan? What am I? Am I in this camp or that camp? And most of us don't like being put in that position, but there's a whole lot of young men on Twitter right now fighting with each other, total strangers, over things being said on, YouTube or social media spaces by, the public intellectual that they have decided to carry water for, and it's very strange. It's very strange to behold, I guess in the era of social media, it's been weaponized in a much more effective way with people's fan bases. I don't know if it's that way with music anymore, though. Stray thoughts. What can I say? He mentions how, Eddie Van Halen was the great American guitar hero. You have to go back to Jimi Hendrix to find anyone at that level. He was incredibly good looking and likable. He had the painted guitars, the fucking sneakers, whatever it was. Van Halen was mostly about Eddie Van Halen. The interviewer says, both you and Gary left around the same time. What happened? I don't think it's anything that Gary did. It was simply because the album wasn't successful, so Ed and Al pulled the plug. When you've always been successful and suddenly you're not successful, it gets magnified, especially when you live in LA and you're surrounded by the music business. Some bands would have shrugged it off and made another record, thinking we've got the benefit of 100 shows or whatever we did under our belt, it'll be better. We'll do whatever. We'll bring in a better producer, a different producer, a co-writer. Whatever it was, there was none of that. They just got beat at the box office and Gary was out. And I can't tell you if they recorded another album with Gary whether it would have been any better or more successful. They'd already been one of the very few bands on the planet that managed to change singers and still be hugely successful. Maybe there just wasn't a chance in hell that they could have gone with a third guy, let alone a fourth guy. When they started recording again with Gary, I think they realized it wasn't going to be different. I don't know whether Al threw in the towel or Ed wasn't in love anymore. I don't know what it was. They ask about the last 20 years, Van Halen has recorded only 2 studio albums. Considering how much music Ed had on file, that's preposterous. Well, it's preposterous and dysfunctional. Candidly, I had redone a record deal for them. They could have made another 4 or 5 records, and Warner Brothers would have paid a small fortune for them. And it wasn't an option, it was a firm deal, but this is back at the height of the record business. They could have made a record every 18 months and kept delivering them. This was not a situation where someone was going to pay them less for the next record or not pick up an option because they hadn't sold enough copies. It was an incredible deal. I didn't know if things were going to work out with David or if they were going to work with Gary Cherone again. I don't know if Steven Tyler or David Coverdale was going to join the band. I had no idea, but Warner Brothers weren't going to let the band go. Was there pressure from the label to get rid of Gary, or was it ultimately just a band decision? No, I can't say there was any pressure. These were all Ed and Al's decisions. People assumed that I had more to do with Gary Cherone than being the singer than I did. Gary was my client in extreme. I liked and respected him, but I didn't force him on the band. Ed had just fallen in love, and that's all there was to it. If at that moment in time Paul McCartney or Robert Plant had called and said, I really want to join fucking Van Halen, I don't think he would have auditioned them because Ed had made his mind up. One time Ed said to me he wished his parents had had 3 boys instead of 2 boys because, damn it, we would have made him a singer. That's a difficult hurdle for any singer to overcome. But still, the guys liked Gary. So when did you decide to leave? They were unhappy and I was unhappy too. Everything was becoming so dysfunctional. And I wasn't the guy that was going to be able to go there and be a cheerleader. And then it started to get carved in stone. I had put Gary Cherone in the band, which, as I have told you, was not true. But as crazy as my time with the band it was a real honor to work with them. And I think I did well by them. I had an advantage over a lot of managers at the time because I owned my own label. Rush had recorded for me. I owned the publishing company. I knew where every nickel, diamond, penny was hidden. And I had been a booking agent. I booked Rush when we were kids, when I was managing them. So that was the part that I really understood, and understood well. I just hadn't taken any courses in psychology or therapy or addiction or any of the things that would have been helpful at times with this band. And those skills weren't needed with Rush or anyone else I'd ever worked with. He says he would have been there for the band if they had done another Gary Cherone album or if they had found another singer. He was still interested in doing it, but things were falling apart. Rush had records that were much bigger than other records, and they didn't need to blame anyone for it. They were very much of the mind that this is our record, we made it, we stand behind it. And if people like it and buy it, it's great. If they don't, hey, it's still our record. They never broke up because they went from a record with Tom Sawyer that sold 3 million copies down to 1.2 million to 800,000. They kept it going. And so that was what I was used to. And eventually Rush recorded another record that did big numbers again. And if you stay in the game and you're really good live, people will always come to see you, especially if you have a good manager and a good agent, and they know the difference between Monday night in Toledo and Saturday night. They asked for his final impressions of Ed. He was as close to Elvis Presley as anybody I was ever going to meet. He was always surrounded and protected by his crew. You've got a bit of Elvis, you got a bit of Prince, you got a bit of whatever. He was not a fully functioning human being. Today, more than ever, addiction is recognized as an illness. God knows what he was prescribed on top of the alcohol issue when he had his hip surgery and cancer surgery. Ed and Al came by their drinking honestly. I'm sure it was inherited. I met the dad, and he was a lovely guy. He was funny. He was personable. He was a lot like Ed. They were incredibly functional for the amount of alcohol they drank. It would have killed most people. Drinking a case of beer was maintenance for them. They would get through the day with beer and then move to wine at night, and then they moved to hard liquor after that. It was like, fuck, I'd never seen anything like it. Other than being a rock star, there's not very many jobs in the world that you could ever hold on to and get away with that.
And now watching here, where he was technically credited as a contributor to the soundtrack, and they use it as wacky chase, chasing noises so funny. There's then that other Eric Stoltz and Leah Thompson connection to Back to the Future, as well as the Eddie Van Halen connection. Nancy Wilson shows up. She, I know she was Cameron Crowe's wife for quite a long time. A couple decades at least, I believe. And she showed up for a split-second cameo in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. In this case, she is the wife of David the cop, who is, plowing out young Leah Thompson behind his wife's back. So I guess there's going to be a confrontation scene later on that I'll get to watch. Bananarama had some involvement in this. They were asked to write the theme song for this film. They had to get it written and recorded and delivered in 3 days. But they had already had a top 10 hit with Cruel Summer in the summer of '84, and because it was in the Karate Kid. And then London Records reissued The Wildlife as their follow-up single in the USA, where it peaked at number 70 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was never released in their native Britain nor in Europe. Wow. I'm gonna check that out.
Hey, everybody. I just wanted to put a disclaimer on this next bit. It sounds different, and I don't know why. There's a little sort of not a feedback, but an echo-ish sort of sound to it, and I apologize for that. It could have been that I had my speakers on, while talking into the microphone. Usually those are muted, and maybe I forgot during this section. It sounds like that might be what's going on, but the information there is all still valuable. Just didn't want you to think I didn't notice this next bit sounds a bit weird. There's like a robot echo. It's like a doubler effect, not even that off-putting really, but it sounds a little inhuman. And checking on it now, there's something I realized. I don't know that... Actually, listen to it first, and then I'm going to make a comment at the end. I'm going to get into a little bit of Noel E. Monk's version of events. He's got a book called Running with the Devil, and I was running across, I was trying to find any mention in the book that might verify or disprove some things David Lee Roth was saying about how he just comes off stage and has to have, like, IVs put in him immediately after every show or whatever. And I searched for I did the old Control F on archive.org, where the book is posted up as PDF if you want to read it for free. You can borrow it for an hour at a time. Archive.org, folks. It's wonderful. And then decide if you want to buy it, go buy a physical copy. Support Noel E. Monk. I'm sure he doesn't necessarily need my money, but he's probably doing better than I am. But hey, if you want to contribute to the person that actually lived the thing and wrote the thing, I think that's great. I have read it before. I checked it out from the library when it came out. But anyways, I didn't read the whole thing back in the day. But this is some stuff about being on the road, and especially in Europe. He was tour manager for Van Halen from, 75 to 85, somewhere around that. And a good long time, let's say. So he talks about there was a morning disclosure that Rudy, the guitar tech turned announcer, had gotten laid the previous night. Now, you have to understand, matters of sex, roadies occasionally benefit from their proximity to rock stars. It's not an everyday occurrence the way it is for the guys in the band. And it sure as hell wasn't commonplace during that month-long tour of the UK. But Rudy apparently had found a companion for the night, and his divulging that news led to a spontaneous burst of applause on the bus. People stood and cheered and patted Rudy on the back for his good fortune. This was, after all, a time for magnanimity. Sorry, folks. Magnanimity. Who could begrudge the guitar tech for getting laid? Surely not Edward, his best friend from high school and his now de facto boss. Eddie just smiled and nodded. So did Alex and Michael. We were all happy that somehow, in this most arid of conjugal climates, when even the biggest dick swingers on the bus were striking out, Rudy had broken the slump. Well, almost, everyone. David said nothing, merely scowled and fidgeted angrily in his seat. Imagine the injustice of it all. The guitar tech getting laid while the lead singer, a veritable pheromone factory, goes home with Rosie Palmer. For most of us, this was cause for celebration, and Rudy downed many a beer later that night without ever touching his wallet. For David, well, not so much, apparently. What happened next was the result of a misguided attempt on my part to lighten the mood by playing a little joke on David. I might as well admit that I should have anticipated the consequences, even then in the early days before he felt the full bloom of stardom and power. David was not particularly good at self-deprecation. He took himself rather seriously, which meant when you poked fun at him, you did it at your own peril. That afternoon, we had lunch at a typically nondescript little English road stop on the M1 heading out to the Midlands. We all sat together at a long, heavy wooden table and tried to stuff our faces with shitty English brunch fare, steak and eggs, greasy hash browns and chips, and hamburgers charred to a carcinogenic black regardless of how you might have ordered them. Thanks largely to Rudy's good fortune, the mood was considerably lighter than it had been in the previous few days. We ate and laughed and told stories, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. Everyone except David, who sat sullenly in his chair, poking at his food and generally behaving like the death of the party. After a while, David excused himself to use the bathroom, leaving behind a plate overflowing with a nest of chips and 2 large, virtually untouched hamburgers. For some reason that I still can't quite explain, although annoyance was probably at the root of it, I was gripped by a sudden urge to take a huge bite out of one of the burgers. Even as I swallowed it, I knew this was probably a mistake and would not be met with the benign response I had intended. A few of the guys at the table saw me take the bite out of David's food, but no one said anything, and no one laughed. A couple of them looked at me like I was crazy, and then simply continued with their meal. A couple minutes later, David emerged from the bathroom and sauntered back to his table. Back to the table. He pulled out his chair, sat down, threw back his hair. Sorry, folks, that's the his that my eyeball jumped down to one line. I've had that problem since I was in school. And his face was ashen. There was a long pause before he spoke, during which he took a hard look around the table. Finally, he picked up the plate, gave it a half spin in his hand, and then slammed it back down, sending chips and hamburger juice in all directions. A silence came over the entire restaurant as David stood up, looking like he was about to give an angry toast. I don't know which one of you stupid fucking shitheads did this, he said, pointing at the plate, still wobbling on the table, but you can finish it. With that, he marched out of the restaurant. After a few moments of awkward silence, we all resumed eating and telling stories, leaving David to cool off on his own. I realized pretty quickly that I had overstepped my bounds. A joke to one person is an act of aggression to another. I certainly hadn't meant to upset David to quite this extent, though I did think he was behaving petulantly and deserved to have his ego tweaked. This was my dance with David throughout our time together. I appreciated and respected his talent and naked ambition, but found his personality at best challenging, at worst sociopathic. Moreover, David had been getting on my nerves to a greater extent than usual, in part because we spent so much time together. By the time we began touring the UK, David had taken to changing his wardrobe multiple times during the course of a show. And somehow it was among my many duties to man the quick change booth just off stage. The booth was really just a makeshift closet space, usually fashioned out of curtains or drapes, in which David would rush off stage between songs or during a guitar solo and change from black leather to brown leather, from leather into spandex or whatever. But since these changes were indeed quick, he needed some assistance, so I would literally wait by the edge of the stage, and when David came running off, I would join him in the quick change booth and help peel off his sweat-soaked pants or shirt. It is not a job I cherished, and not simply because of the obvious grossness of the act, but because David was usually in such a frenzy that working with him in this environment was like trying to collar a pit bull in a phone booth. Bruises were inevitable. Let's go, hurry the fuck up, I'll go out there naked, I swear to fucking Christ. Easy, David, easy does it. The inherent narcissism of becoming a rock star would fuck with anyone's head, but David was well down the path even before he joined Van Halen. He had always been, as they say, a legend in his own mind, and when legitimate stardom and success came his way, he devoured it like a drug. Increasingly, I would notice David posing at every opportunity, not just in the dressing room before going on stage, but every time he passed a mirror or window, I'd catch him pausing and vamping, tossing his hair, sucking in his cheeks like a model. He was obsessed with his appearance. Nevertheless, I felt bad about what I had done in the restaurant and the apparent distress it caused him. What I disliked most about David was his tendency to bully and manipulate, and my little joke, while harmless, exhibited exactly some of those traits. I considered it nothing more than giving David a tiny dose of his own medicine, but he obviously felt otherwise. So to make amends, I ordered a new plate of food as we were nearing the end of our meal, asked the waitress to box it up, delivered it to David on the bus. He was sitting cross-legged in a front window seat, indulging a mighty sulk. As I stopped in the aisle and tried to make eye contact, he did not move an inch and steadfastly avoided my gaze. David, I'm sorry, I said to the side of his head. I did not mean to piss you off. This was not entirely true. I did hope to elicit a reaction from David. I just didn't think it would be quite so severe. He didn't budge, gave no indication that he had even heard what I said, although clearly he had. I decided to press on. I have something for you, I said, holding out the box, which was by this time beginning to show signs of strain, with a large grease blot spreading across the bottom like some sort of industrial spill. You're probably hungry, so here, please take this. Through inaction, he declined, so I sat down next to him and placed the sagging box between us. I'm not sure exactly how much time passed before the tension thawed, perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, during which I occasionally tried to make small talk. Eventually, almost out of the blue, David turned to me and smiled. It's okay, Noel. I was just fooling around. He paused, reached down, opened the box, and he withdrew a wilted burger, took a giant bite, and nodded assuredly. How'd you going there, didn't I? There was a myriad ways to respond to this line of bullshit. By now, I knew David well enough to understand both his ego and insecurities. He didn't want to be perceived as small or petty, even though he demonstrably was. He didn't want people to think he was thin-skinned or weak, even though he routinely threw temper tantrums. David was complicated. At heart, he was an entitled rich kid, which informed many of his relationships and behavior. He was accustomed to acting on every impulse, and as his stardom and wealth and drug use accrued, he naturally made less effort to keep his emotions in check. On this day, though, it was clear that he felt somewhat ashamed about having stormed out of the restaurant. I felt bad, too, but I wasn't about to get into a heavy discussion about which one of us had been less mature. Yeah, you sure did, David, I said, slapping him on the back. Then I grabbed one of his chips and stuffed it into my mouth. David laughed. Help yourself, Noel. Again, editors. Could you parse out the middle chunk with the side stage dressing booth thing and keep the events of the same hour together? I like the story about the dressing booth and everything, but I don't know what it has to do with the cheeseburgers and the chips. It was just an aside. It was an aside that was great, but it feels like it should be discussed when it comes to like other stage issues on the tour. I don't know, folks. I'm not a book publisher. What do I know? I'm just a nobody here, reading stuff other people wrote and enjoying the hell out of it. I hope you are too. Now, is it me, or did Noel not do the best job in the world of actually proving that Dave's cranky attitude was because the guitar tech got laid? I feel like, especially after doing more reading about Eddie versus Dave versus other people in the band and Dave's attitude at this point and his sort of grandiose, I don't know, his grandiosity, self-instilled grandiosity maybe that he wanted to project. Is it really just that somebody else was getting attention for 30 seconds and it wasn't Dave? Or was Dave... I could see this just being Dave cranky about something totally unrelated. Because if it was about... if he retaliated against the guitar tech in some way or embarrassed the guitar tech in some way, I think that puts the whole story together nicely. But I don't know. So I'm not saying it didn't happen. Obviously, it happened. I'm not saying... it's impossible for that to have been David's motivation for being mad at everybody. I'm just saying, as an author and a storyteller, Noel Monk didn't do a great job of connecting those dots. I do still recommend his book, and I do also recommend his, it's a book he largely contributed to, along with, one or two other guys, about his time on the road with the Sex Pistols. Look that up. Good stuff. It's just that time that the Pistols were in America, touring largely, through the Southwest and Midwest, and it's freaking wild. Now, I have put you through a lot. If you're a Eddie Van Halen fan in this episode, I have put you through, a lot of dissenting voices and a lot of David Lee Roth stuff. So I want to kind of cap this one off before moving on to recording part 4 with some technical stuff straight from Eddie's, side of the road. We're going to go back to 2004, 2005 and talk about the creation of his own, his own line of musical equipment. And I read about this when it happened in guitar magazines. It was really inspiring and very cool. And I think, even if you're not a guitarist and you just love Van Halen for what they were, or if you are a fan of Eddie, even though you don't know about the tech stuff and the building of the instruments and the the technical details of how he did what he did, but you admire him, I think this will be helpful and fun and kind of nice and informative when it comes to a look inside his mentality and his brain and his motivation and his sort of a very admirable obsession with, the signal chain, the physics of it all sometimes, and the design of it all. And I don't know, this hits me hard because I'm a luthier and I went to a guitar building school 23 years ago, and the study of what it takes to make a string vibrate as long as possible at a certain pitch, and then what makes that energy travel into the body of an instrument and resonate deeply and create tones that you can't get with certain materials and certain construction styles and certain there's a chain that has to happen. It's like conducting electricity. There's a chain between your fingers or your pick and the striking of the string and the journey of that energy into the body of the guitar and how the tone will reflect off of the body surface and the fretboard surface, whether it's maple or ebony or rosewood, and then how it's amplified by electronics, by copper wire and magnets into a passive signal that is then amplified even further by an active signal through vacuum tubes or transistors and then pushed into speakers or pushed along another chain of code into a digital sort of space, depending on how you're using your gear. It's a lifelong pursuit for lots of people, and to quote the great John Reuter, who is the head instructor at the Roberto Van School of Lutherie in Phoenix, Arizona, when I was there, and has been for a long time, multiple decades. Every time I build a guitar, I'm throwing a dart at a dartboard. And every time I learn more processes and learn new methods of doing things to accomplish the tones I want to get, I'm getting closer to that bullseye on that dartboard. But then the problem is your awareness, not the problem. I'm paraphrasing him. This is from 23 years ago. It's my memory. But then what happens is the more you learn about these processes and about tone and resonance and sustain and all of this, these different materials you start using, suddenly the bullseye moves farther and farther away from you. And you have to throw harder. And you don't get the bullseye results you thought you were getting because you realize you never got them in the first place. Your perception was you were nailing it, but in reality, your expectations start to grow and your pressure on yourself to do things in a more specific way and achieve more specific outcomes starts to sort of grow and multiply. And that moves the dartboard farther away. And you learn more, you throw harder, and you start getting close again. And he says, but if I ever truly feel that I've hit the bullseye perfectly and I continue to do so every time, it's all over. I'm deluding myself and I might as well go home and put a gun in my head and blow my fucking brains out. Anyway, I learned more from that trade school in 6 months than I did in all my high school years and my 2.5 years in community college and anything else I've done in a mildly academic form of any kind. So in the book, they talk about this 2005 significant things were taking place in Ed's life that seemed like he was either starting anew or burning bridges. In an attempt to reinvent himself, he secludes himself away from the music world. His only press coverage during this period was in paparazzi photos in the tabloid media and lurid reports that speculated about his declining health and new romantic partners. His mother, Eugenia, passes away on August 4th that year, and he moves even further away from the public eye. Then, December 7th of 2005, Valerie Bertinelli files for divorce after they'd been separated for 5 years. Valerie says, when he played, he disappeared into a world that was his. There he was the most comfortable, and whatever he shared was of his own choosing. This interior world would confound, anger, and frustrate me to no end later on. But early on, it was seductive. Then around the summer of 2006, Ed comes out of his self-imposed exile to announce he has composed some new music, which is very different from any Van Halen stuff that had been released previously. July 26th, there's a press release that reveals he's recorded 2 songs, Catherine and Rise, for an adult film called Sacred Sin. And he also helped fund the production of the film and allowed his house to be used for the filming of several of the sex scenes in it. This was one of only a handful of instances when a famous musician composed music for a pornographic film. And Ed's example was particularly unique because he was a bona fide A-list star who did it after he achieved fame. And he used his own name instead of a pseudonym. So, he then puts out a 6-minute music video for Catherine. And a lot of folks took it as a bad sign of things for him. He was like sweaty and not wearing a shirt and just playing all by himself in the dark in his studio. There's a bottle of wine on the mixing console. He's smoking a cigarette while he plays violently. And he slams his guitar into the studio floor at the end of the video. Clearly, he appeared to a lot of people to be floundering and frustrated and not really necessarily on good terms with his muse musically. But after this, he starts working with Michael Nin, who's the guy that was directing the adult film in question. And through Michael, he meets Jane Liziewski, who was his publicist. This soon leads to Janie becoming Ed's publicist as well, and then becomes Ed's girlfriend. I recall grabbing Valerie Bertinelli's autobiography in a Barnes & Noble when it came out, just to flip through it and see if I could catch any mention of Eddie Van Halen. She dedicated, I think she dedicated the book to them, to Janie and Ed, and in a sort of like, I hope you'll be very happy together. You know, I wish you all the best, kind of a thing. Very magnanimous of her. But around the summer of 2006, then he starts jamming with his son, Wolfgang, who had started playing bass after already being a guitarist and a drummer. Alex and Ed start jamming with Wolfgang after that and really, really, really getting into it. Ed reveals this new development on the Howard Stern show in October 2006. And I believe that's the interview I heard where he says he has hired doctors to help him cure cancer, and they cut a piece of his tongue out and they put it in a petri dish, and it's totally illegal. We figured out how to stop cancer. Oh man, it was kind of uncomfortable. It was weird. It was very quirky in an unsettling way, that interview. Then he announces he's launching his own musical instrument company, EVH Brand. That was not a typical like artist endorsement thing where like a company just makes the things they're going to make, and they put your name on it, and you pose for some pictures, and you choose your neck carve, like a D shape or a C shape or a V shape, or what do you want, and what kind of electronics that we already make will we put in this for you? Nope. He is very actively creating this, every single component, just as it was back in the 70s when he created his Frankenstein guitar. He's got his hands in every single part and component of these instruments. So it's put out through Fender Musical Instrument Company or Corporation. And he says, Fender builds my stuff for me, but it's my own company. I started it because I want to do what I fucking want. What I'm doing now is like an extension of how I started. Nobody made what I need or want, so I made it myself. It's great to see my ideas become a reality. And then in 2007, the EVH brand introduces its first offering, a limited edition replica of the red, white, and black Frankenstein guitar. All the dings, dents, and scratches are replicated, and I saw one of these at my guitar fixing job at the time, and the person who brought it in wanted to sort of quiz me on what I knew about Eddie's preferences and tell me their preferences. It was very cool. It was a very cool looking thing. Like, this person was obviously very, protective of the instrument and protective of their fandom of Mr. Eddie Van Halen, and it was a nice experience. It's got the fucking quarter sitting underneath the bass side of the Floyd Rose with a D-tuna on it, if you know what that is. It's wow. It was something else. The cigarette burns are on it. And I think they did that with like tobacco. If you soak metal guitar parts in tobacco juice, it will kind of give it a fake rusty look or a fake cigarette, like brownish yellowish kind of stain look to it. And that's pretty well. That's a sort of a common theme, especially with Fender Stratocaster parts, where you just like take the plastic white knobs and pick guard and just dunk them in, stuff like that. Anyhow, I'm getting off track here. So let's go back in time a little bit and then talk about the lead up to the EVH brand with Fender, and go way back to the late 70s, where Eddie starts noticing, when he goes on his little trips to guitar shops and stuff to see what's going on and what ideas he likes in other people's guitars and components, and what he might sort of take home and pick apart to analyze and maybe use for his own guitars to play. He starts seeing a lot of copies of the thing he had done, his Frankenstrat. A lot of things with one humbucker, one volume knob, and a vibrato, tremolo bar, whammy bar, whatever you call it. And, he gets annoyed when Charvel kind of jumps on that bandwagon. Without talking to him about it, they start selling reproductions of the black and yellow guitar he had custom ordered from them, and that they had actually called it the Van Halen model without consulting him or getting his permission. Now, he had mentioned Charvel in a bunch of guitar interviews, and to sort of help them get noticed and get some notoriety and some business. But this move of theirs, without his input or approval, kind of turned him, pretty sour on the company. Now, he would soon sort of pivot into a relationship with the guitar company called Kramer, with a K. And funny enough, the guy responsible for it didn't really know much about Eddie Van Halen at that point. We're talking 1982, and Dennis Berardi is flying to Anaheim, California for a music industry convention. I would assume that is NAMM, N-A-M-M. And he ends up sitting next to Van Halen's tour manager. They start talking about vibrato, tremolo bar designs, and bridge, electric guitar bridges. And then that leads to discussing Eddie himself, and Berardi gets invited to meet Edward in Los Angeles. He says, I didn't know much about Eddie Van Halen at that point. I knew he was a great guitar player, but I didn't know anything about the guitars he played. He invited me into his house, and while I was sitting there, I saw his red, white, and black guitar. I took a closer look at it, and I was thinking, what a piece of shit. We started talking, and I told him how Gibson and Fender's guitars were terrible, and they were ripping kids off. I told him that Kramer wanted to build really great guitars. Just like that, he said, all right, let's do it. Let's make Kramer number one. I asked if he wanted to endorse Kramer guitars, and he agreed. So a few months later, they make the official announcement in June of 82, where Kramer announces the guitar endorsement deal for Eddie Van Halen and them. Now, something I didn't really know about, or if I did, I've forgotten this detail, was that they had announced part of the endorsement of the Eddie Van Halen guitars coming with the Edward Van Halen tremolo locking system, developed by a German company called Rockinger, that had been installed on a bunch of Kramer models. And Ed agreed to endorse those units on first meeting with Berardi, but then after a while he kind of had to come out to them and say he really preferred the Floyd Rose system instead. Double locking tremolo that he had already been used to and been using for a few years. So Kramer wants to keep Eddie happy. They licensed the Floyd Rose system for their guitars, but they were more expensive to produce than the Rockinger version. Floyd Rose is still building them by hand at that point, which I didn't know. And there's a lot of modification to a guitar that comes with putting a Floyd Rose on it. If some of this is over your head, don't worry about it. Let's just say it's an invasive process to put this nut and bridge into the average guitar. And once you do it, there's no going back. Okay, you can glue wood back in. Sure, you could if you want to. It's a lot of work, though. But I guess Kramer crunched the numbers and decided that, like, if they could be known for being the Eddie Van Halen guitar producing company and the company that puts out the most guitars with the Floyd Rose system, they would, make their money back and achieve a pretty high standard in the industry for having that reputation. So they somehow figured out a way to mass produce the units for less money. It has to do with how they were installed in the factory, and I would have to assume some of it might have to do with, streamlining the manufacturing in a certain way, but also maybe using cheaper metal for the parts. I don't know. Surely it wasn't as bad as what was about to happen in the 80s with the Floyd Rose licensed tremolos with pot metal parts and drilled into poplar wood bodies that would just sort of cave in over the course of many years, where the bridge post would just start to lean forward and then just stop when they hit the pick guard in a lot of older instruments I've seen working in repair shops. But the endorsement deal with Eddie and Kramer was an instant success, and money did start pouring in. And he was doing ads for them. He was performing at guitar trade shows and playing some of his own homemade ideas with Kramer logos placed on the headstock on tour and in some of their music videos. So he gave them a big boost when it came to their image, their sales, their notoriety. And eventually, people start to realize that, and I'm not quite sure the text of the Eruption book makes this clear in the narrative that I've been sort of pulling from here at this point, that they didn't actually put out a production model Eddie Van Halen guitar for people to buy. And Eddie didn't play any of their off-the-shelf style instruments, like straight out of the box, like, here's a Kramer guitar that I play. I'm Eddie Van Halen. He makes money, I guess, through them somehow that's not really explained in this book, because they don't talk about it being a production model. They talk about him playing them live, and him making money, I guess, through the deal. I guess they got their Floyd Rose on their guitars through him, and they just, I don't know, they let him come to their factory in Neptune, New Jersey, and he gets to build some of his own guitars with, some of their parts and stuff. And they're backups for him. There's like a special double neck model. He does some modified ones featuring a Steinberger trans trem or a Fernandez sustainer. Those are very, very specific, innovative pieces of gear that I won't explain right here, but let's just say they're pretty futuristic for their time, and they weren't available in a lot of production, guitars the average person could afford. They introduced a model called the Beretta in '84 that was clearly a nod to the Eddie Van Halen design, but he was never seen officially playing one as far as the history of this relationship is concerned. And then Kramer gets a little big for their britches. They sort of lose sight of what it is they're really doing. And I think there's more of their story that I cover in my shred guitar episodes revolving around the movie Crossroads from 1987. If I'm not mistaken, it's been a little while though. But that's what I think I read from a Guitar World magazine history of that company. Things got weird. They sink their money into some side ventures that don't pan out, and they fall way behind on payments. Or maybe I'm thinking of like they did this for sure, but I also might have talked about Grover and Jackson in that episode. So apologies to anyone that wants me to be really specific right now. But rest assured, if you want to hear some history of 80s shred guitar and a couple of the companies that were responsible for some of the more well-known and striking designs of the time, check those out. It's from about a year and a half to, I'd say a year and a half ago in the main feed. Let's see. So he severs his ties with Kramer. And then in 1990, his accountant notices, they failed to make some royalty payments to him. And some of those strings that he had to deal with them with Kramer were actually made by Ernie Ball. He had a series called 5150 strings. And he then moves into a relationship with the Ernie Ball Company instead. And before Eddie, their highest profile guitar players on the roster were Albert Lee and Steve Morse. If you don't know who they are, that's okay. If you do know who they are, then you know who they are, and you know that they were players above all else. Now, the Ernie Ball Music Man relationship he starts is an interesting one because the design of his guitar was so unlike what he had played before. This is sort of, for some of us that came to know Van Halen in the 90s, the sort of the design that we knew him, as playing and appearing on stage with, appearing in videos with, not the super strat, version of what he'd done in the 80s or 70s. It has two pickups instead of one. It's got the Floyd Rose tremolo, but it's got a basswood body with a maple top. A lot of times a figured maple top. It's got some pattern to it with a colorful finish, like a see-through kind of stain to it, instead of his, taped up stripes. And the first one gets on the market in 1991. Edwards says, "I'm not in this for the money. If I was, I wouldn't be limiting production to 1,000 guitars a year. I just want people to pick up this guitar 20 years from now and say, geez, that's a nice instrument. This guitar is so much more versatile than my Frankenstein because of the front pickup, but the neck is exactly the same as my original guitar. They digitally measured every inch of it so they could duplicate it. It's already broken in. Basically, we copied a comfortable pair of old shoes. I used to endorse the guitar I played, but I designed this one. It's a whole different ball game." So then he decides he's going to contact the PV Amplifier Company about getting a signature amp. That will then morph into a guitar relationship years later when he is no longer endorsing the Music Man or Ernie Ball guitar. And they will go on producing guitars that still look similar, called the Axis model instead of the Eddie Van Halen model. And Peavey will start producing 5150 amps, and then eventually, when he leaves them, produce the 6505 amps. Interesting to note that in the last 22 years of Eddie's life, he had only produced 2 Van Halen albums. So in a lot of ways, obsessing over his gear and his brand and getting these guitars built and produced and getting the new EVH amplifiers, engineered and out the door was a pretty huge deal for him creatively during that time. Here are some quotes from him being interviewed about this little era of the release of the EVH amps from Fender and the EVH guitars from Fender. I'm constantly futzing with stuff and tone chasing, closing my eyes and playing guitar and getting a feel for it. The Wolfgang was a culmination of 35 years of experimenting with guitars. That's the Peavey stuff that he did was under the name Wolfgang. It was what the model was called. It was like the Ernie Ball guitar, but it had a carved maple top instead of a flat quilted maple top. Everything that I've destroyed, everything that I've stumbled onto, everything that I know and have experienced in my journey to get where we are now is in this guitar. And I'm sure that there's more to come. A guitar is a very personal extension of the person playing it. It's kind of like a race car driver. The racing team will ask the driver, how does that feel as they adjust the camshaft? You have to be emotionally and spiritually connected to your instrument. I'm very brutal on my instruments, but not all the time. I'm not to the point where I'm like Pete Townsend and smashing the shit out of it after a gig. I wouldn't do that to an instrument that's part of me. I'm constantly searching. The only thing that the EVH Wolfgang has in common with the Peavey Wolfgang is the body shape. And even that's changed a little bit. Everything's a little different. Everything else. The way the neck bolts on, the frets, the tuning pegs, the binding, the pickups, the tailpiece, the pots. Pots are the tone and volume controls. The cavity is developed to let the wood breathe and age better. Even the output jack is different. We tore apart and analyzed every little thing on the EVH Wolfgang. If someone didn't make something that was good enough for us, we found someone else to make it. This is the Ferrari, Audi R8, or Porsche of guitars for me. I don't need to do this for financial reasons. It's just the people have always wanted to play what I use, so I decided to give that to them. I've worked with a lot of companies, and this actually was my last attempt, sad enough to say. When you're working with a major company, it's not easy for them to drop everything. They can't just stop making Strats and go to work on my guitar. Working with three-piece suitors and the BS that I've had to go through to get through to those people, I could have just stayed at home and built this guitar for myself. It's a bit different to build a one-off guitar for myself, just like when I built my black and white Boogie Bodies Frankenstein guitar. All of a sudden, every company on the planet started copying the one pickup Strat style with a whammy bar guitar. But none of them were anything like mine. They didn't get it. They just looked at it. They didn't play it or feel it or have any idea what went into that guitar. If you hang the Wolfgang next to any other guitar in the store, people may not notice it. It's kind of like chicks. They might look good dressed up, but take the clothes off, bitch, and let's see what you really look like. From the basics of the guitar to painstaking aspects like the binding and everything else, we left no stone unturned. We redid everything on this guitar. That's why it took so long. Thank God that Chip Ellis, the guitar designer from Fender Musical Instrument Company, stuck it out because I was driving everybody nuts. Now, there's a lot more to this interview, and I want to get into it. I want to get it all into your ears on the next episode. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for giving a damn about Van Halen and giving a damn about rock and roll. I want to remind you that you deserve to have a good time. You deserve to be loved. You deserve to be creatively inspired. And you should be free to pursue whatever it is that makes you feel like a whole human being. Whatever it takes to allow you, at the end of the day, to enter your own home justified. If you like the show, please think about supporting via Patreon or PayPal. There are links to those things in the description of this episode. If you're on YouTube or a podcasting platform, well, you are. But please subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to leave a review of some sort on Apple Podcasts. I believe that helps. I'm told so by all of the 7 different podcasts I listen to on a weekly basis. You can find the Patreon at www.patreon.com/rockfilmrock and enjoy some very deeply historical rock and roll material, as well as some little bits and pieces from magazines that aren't so deeply historical, maybe something from the 80s or the 90s, but a lot of the stuff I cover there, it's all me. A lot of stuff I cover there goes into the prehistory of rock and roll too, as well as the classic era with some Beatles and some Stones stuff. Every episode is 2 hours long. You get 2 full episodes a month for $3 a month. You even get some little bits and pieces of Gilbert Gottfried singing some one-hit wonders to you that I've stolen from that wonderful deceased man's old podcast episodes and sort of chopped in there for a few seconds here and there. If you're new to the main feed, please feel free to scroll back through the last few years. All the material you will see is evergreen. None of it is focused on current events. None of it is out of date, unless I mention the weather that day. Now, above all else, if there's nothing I've said today that you remember tomorrow, well, number one, enjoy listening to this whole episode again tomorrow. I hope you like it just as well the second time. But I will leave you with this, as I always will. Rock and roll is the best. And so are you.